So guys,
Yeah, we're rushed off our feet right now.
so welcome guys. Thanks for hanging out today, for starters. If you want to give a little quick round, because not everyone's familiar with all of the Shadow Priest community guys, if you want to give a little introduction here and we can get going.
Yeah, Public, you first.
Yeah, sure thing. So, hey everybody, my name is Publik. I've been in and around Shadow Priest for basically since kind of start of Legion. So I kind of was like a void form baby, so to speak. Mostly work on SimC and kind of do all the sims for Shadow Priest and keep that up to date as much as possible. Also the current maintainer of the Icy Veins guide for Shadow, so I've been helping out there and just kind of doing whatever I can do to make Shadow fun and playable. So that's me.
I am Ellipsis, otherwise known as Ice Bear. I have been playing Shadow for 14 years, I think, give or take. I'm very much not a void form baby, but have got involved more in the Shadow Priest community in the recent years, kind of getting into the theory crafting side in Legion, and since then being quite active in the community and just trying to focus on taking ideas and feelings and how the spec plays and trying to put it into words that other people can understand.
Okay. Sweet. All right. Well, welcome. So you guys have the little roadmap laid out here. So chat, just so you guys know, we're going to be talking a bit about history of Shadow Priest starting in Legion, which is when this kind of major revamp happened with void form and insanity, etc. To really kind of get to the roots of, well, why we are where we are now. Then we're going to talk about where we are now, and then we're going to talk about obviously all of these huge amounts of changes and whether or not these are changes in the positive direction. And then we're going to take a step back and discuss more of kind of meta issues surrounding like why Shadow Priest got in the position it did, why other classes, which ironically we were talking about earlier, and specs get in the positions that they're in, and maybe what could be done in the future to, you know, not have a class kind of be poo-poo for 2-3 years at a time, etc. So, that being said, gents, whoever really wants to hammer it between you two, why don't you just give us a brief start here of what the major changes to Shadow Priest were in Legion, which is kind of where it all started, really, leading us down this road in the first place.
Yeah, I can kind of like briefly. The biggest thing here was that Shadow came from a place of like Shadow Orbs or whatever the iteration was at the time, and basically moved into this brand new concept of the game called void form. They added a whole new resource system into the game. It was basically never really been done before, and so Shadow's been kind of living in this new void form era since then. And it was like bigger things that were added to the spec back then that really, I think, for myself and others in the spec, like Surrender to Madness, which is basically you're literally your character's going insane and constantly getting more and more haste and whatever else. And it had, I think, like originally what brought me to the spec was just the massive amount of pace that the spec had, and just felt like it was really chugging along and felt great to play. It also did way too much damage, I think, especially at the start of Legion. But this really kind of kicked off an entire the redesign that we have so far with Void Form and Void Bolt and Void Eruption and all these tools, while still keeping, we still have dots, some core elements of the spec stayed the same, like Shadow Fiend, things like that. And they kind of threw this kind of new Void Form flavor on top. And that's kind of what we've been rocking with since Legion.
So,
yeah,
go ahead.
I think from as a perspective of somebody who's been playing Shadow for probably about 7 years, probably, until that point, while it was this sort of evolution in a sense towards the more void-centric stuff, and the core, I guess you would call them mind spells, still existed in terms of Mind Flame, Mind Blast, and all the base spells you learn at like level 10, level 20, etc. that Shadow Priest got used to. The core mechanic that drove the spec kind of got flipped on its head and changed from something that felt very at its baseline powerful and strong in sustained damage areas to something that was considerably more niche in terms of this like addition of a ramping mechanic, and obviously the addition of Surrender to Madness and the sort of consequent madness and insanity that we wrought throughout Emerald Nightmare.
So, okay. So when we started, it was kind of working, right? Like the redesign, if I remember correctly, 4 years ago now, was pretty popular. It was interesting. People liked it. Obviously, it was bonkers overpowered with Surrender to Madness, as you guys mentioned in Emerald Knight. Just a bit. So it was fine at the start. Do you guys believe that it was fine at the start generally, and it wasn't just a numbers tuning thing that made them so powerful?
I think it was pretty broken.
It was definitely broken, yes. I would probably call it more of a honeymoon period in which the initial changes alongside the overpoweredness and just the whole new toy syndrome that people get when something changes massively and they want to try and work out what's going on. And also the initial appeal of the concept of void form, if I was to pitch it in an elevator to you in like 15 seconds, sounds amazing. But ultimately, after like years of gameplay, like the issues started to come to the forefront. Obviously, some people had noticed them fairly early on, but as we got more patches to play with it, the problems started surfacing for more and more people, and we just got to a point where, despite the fact the spec could have been amazing from what you described it as, ultimately I don't think it was ever in a particularly healthy place, personally.
Yeah, like, totally. It was basically like, this is one of the first times I think they really left like an uncapped, as good as you are at the game, you get better results, right? And there was really no cap for the most part on how good you could be to put out great numbers, right? If you could time your Surrender to Madness and your Void Form correctly, if you had like very good reaction time and not a lot of latency, you could just do insane amounts of damage that wasn't really capped in any way. And so, you know, we basically came tumbling down throughout Legion just through like, you know, waves of nerfs to bring it back in line and eventually cap out its damage at a certain extent, which was kind of just inevitable with you know, this is that high risk reward gameplay, but to like on steroids, basically.
But there was a certain time when kind of Surrender to Madness was not really the jam anymore for a while. So, I mean, we've had quite a long road since this freshly established spec that we just spoke about, but it seems like from the get-go, we were having cracks in there, or the seams were kind of bursting. There were cracks in the spec, and it was only a matter of time before the issues compounded to the level we are now. So were there major points along the line before we reached this point in Shadowlands beta that really started to detriment the spec? Because I remember, I mean, personally, right now, I'm certainly not a pro Shadow Priest player here or anything like that, but I enjoyed playing the spec at the end of Legion. It was, you know, the one little vacation DPS spec that I usually do at the end of the expansion. It was fun, Shadow or Death at the time, etc., etc. And I personally couldn't put my finger on it, but it just felt really bland and empty when I got to that point again in BFA, towards the end of BFA. I'm not really sure where the disconnect there was.
I think some of it comes from how directly your like void form stack number was in that time period to your damage progression in the end. Like, you could feel this whole, each stack had this sort of visceral feeling to it of like, you gain 1% more haste per stack and 2% more dot damage per stack. And if you were doing Mythic Plus, for example, and you had 30 stacks and your tank finished their pull, and you were kind of egging them on to go on to the next trash pack before you dropped out again, and getting to start that pack at 40, which was already like 80% increased dot damage, and going from 40 to 70 on that pack instead of dropping down to 0, which is 0% dot damage, and trying to build back again. That difference between how it felt if it went well and how it felt if it didn't meant that when it went well, it felt really, really good. Whereas a lot of the changes in PFA were to kind of curb the delta, like the difference between how well things went for you if they went flawlessly and how well they went if they went terribly. And it kind of created this point where the stacks mattered in terms of how many you got on average over a very, very long period of time, but the actual value of what stack are you at this moment disappeared completely. That's sort of the difference between the chorus changes and mass hysteria, which we had in Legion.
They basically have since Legion, they, you know, introduced us to spec, they kind of struggled to give void form like a purpose, like an actual meaning to like that damage, because, you know, unlike Fire Mage or, you know, whatever other spec in the game that revolves around a big cooldown, up until now, Shadows basically had no cooldown. And you've effectively just been a consistent point of damage, but you had a lot of ramp to get up to that damage. And more or less, I think they kind of struggled to find like giving it a reason to live more or less that wasn't really broken. They've done stacking haste, they've done stacking dot damage. BFA, they added, like Ellipsis mentioned, Course of Insanity, which gave you a bonkers amount of crit at the end after your void form ended. And I think a lot of this was almost kind of done like accidentally, just because the spec just has so many things, so many moving pieces happening at once that it was really easy to kind of go off the rails with like one single change. Whether that's with Auspicious Spirits or crit or massive levels of haste or dots going crazy. We've kind of like been through everything. Yeah, with like everything, right? Of like, okay, you give us enough stats, you give us enough gear, or time to find a build, and there's like some way to break it to make it actually do damage, right? And I think that was kind of the constant struggle of having a mechanic that was inherently, so long-winded and maybe even complex to a degree, where it's unlike, traditional 3-minute cooldown where it's like, okay, you press your button, you do damage for 20 seconds, and then you kind of have like an off period. Shadow's really never played like that.
Yeah,
I
think. Go ahead.
So Shadow has never historically played like that before. We've never been a cooldown reliant spec, but it's the first time we've ever felt like our damage was ever off. Again, compared to like the 3-minute cooldown, like 2-minute downtime thing. Shadow has always had like this. We're always sort of on all the time, and then there's a point afterwards, or a point where we get a bit stronger from a cooldown or something. But all the time, we're always sort of on all the time. So if something spawned and you need to hit it, Shadow Priest could always hit it reasonably hard. We couldn't blow it up, but we had something for it. Whereas once we shifted to this ramp paradigm, there was a good chance that you were like really early on in the ramp and just had nothing to give. And that was a big difference compared to like previous Shadow to current Shadow. And this whole nothing to give period was something that Blizzard seemed to push really hard to mitigate going out of Legion into BFA. But also in trying to remove this nothing to give period, it kind of removed the top end from voidform as well, and took away all the stat scaling and gameplay scaling that made it fun in the first place. It was like you could either be viable in all content, or you could have a fun top end. You couldn't really have both.
Yeah, I remember the days of grinding Moth Souls in like 7.1. I remember I was playing with Vikland a lot then, and he could do insane damage at the time, but it had to be like you had to construct everything around catering to the Shadow Priest every time. Like
Absolutely.
every pull, like I'm ready to go. I got, void form, etc. And it seems like the issues have just gotten worse and worse over time. But let me ask you, some of the issue, especially from kind of like a raid leading perspective, we were just talking about this in chat earlier as well, Publik. I know you were around. Some of the conception of what Shadow really specializes in and what they bring to the table just often is very mismatched with the kind of damage that you want to bring in, let's say, M+, where it's about, just like you said, Ellipsis, hey guys, here's the big pull, everybody get your 3 or 2-minute cooldowns and let's go. Or in a raid, like, hey, we got to push, CDs here, we're going to lust here. You just kind of had this wavering sine wave of damage going in and out with void form a lot of the time, and it was very, the good Shadow Priest players certainly it seems we're able to time those things, but often it's so hard to match up for your average player.
Yeah, absolutely. You're really just like, it's very similar if anyone's doing keys right now with the Fire Mage, especially kind of higher keys, right? Like you're doing the entire dungeon kind of around their combust timings, around their font timings if they're using that, right? And basically Shadow's been like that since it was added to the game in Legion, right? If you didn't pull a dungeon especially around, making sure you can chain pull as much as possible to keep up void form, which, obviously is, has a range of even that, if that's even possible, if it's like bolstering, right? And Shadow's damage was much more about how are you pulling the dungeon rather than like, can Shadow do enough damage? I would argue, like, honestly, especially in BFA, our damage in dungeons is actually pretty amazing, even if probably better than Fire Mage was up until recently. It was really just about having a tank that you played with consistently that was like, oh, I know your damage pattern, I will pull around it to make sure the group can benefit from that. And you're just never going to see that in like a pug environment, which kind of meant, I think, facilitated this. Well, I really want to invite a Shadow Priest because, I don't know how they work or how they play or how I make them do great damage. And that was just kind of that stigma around the entire spec, right?
Yeah. I think it's all saying Shadow like did really well in this sort of mid-range environment where everyone knew what was going on, but they still weren't doing the sort of things you saw in the MDI or like really high key pushers do. Like I imagine, so you know that when you do a tank pull that's in a really high key, there's a lot of prep that goes into how exactly we're going to do this, who's going to go and get what thing, how we're going to group it all back together. And that sort of preparation phase, obviously it's not as long in an MDI pull as like somebody trying to attempt it in like a 26 or something, but that sort of preparation before pulls is just not something Shadow can really handle very well. So you end up in a situation where the low keys with the like weaker, like less coordinated groups is too slow between small pulls, but the really high keys want to do this complicated big pulls that take too long to set up for Shadow to really hold on to the damage they had from beforehand to be able to use it.
Yeah, I mean, it's your ramp-up issue, really, is what it is. But on top of that, let's talk about utility for a second, because that is certainly a lacking spot for Shadow as well. Now, that's been kind of indirectly made better now because of the changes to bursting and being dispellable, so you're going to get a lot more play with Mass Dispel. But what do you guys see as flaws with their utility or lack thereof that makes them less desirable to bring to raids and dungeons? Public, let's start with you.
Man, I could talk about this for days. I
That's good
love
because we got
pushing
nothing
keys.
else to do.
Yeah, I mean, like pushing keys is great, but I think like what I really struggled with on my priest is that I always felt like I was hurting my group by bringing it because I knew if I played almost any other range spec in the game, I had something that was awesome to bring to that group. And like right now on live, that's basically just power word fortitude, like having that extra, what is it, 2% stamina or whatever from having that versus the scroll. We don't have at the time, we don't have like a shroud, we don't have a grip, we don't have a lust or a battle res. There's really nothing that we have that really makes the group be like, oh wow, since we have this, we can pull the dungeon differently, or we have this extra insurance policy or whatever. And I think that kind of homogenous or dehomogenization of useful utility and keys, really stinks. I think the newest affix really helped with that, since we could use those obelisks to like teleport across dungeons, so you didn't need shroud as much. But we really haven't had much utility. It was actually nerfed going into BFA. In Legion, we did have an AoE stun in Mind Bomb, but they decided to make that a disorient instead of a stun, and kind of further nerfed our utility, which to this day I still don't quite understand. Because I think, like, honestly, if Shadow Priest had enough utility and keys, and the Mass Dispel change, making it dispellable bursting, I think that will help. But that's only 1 week out of the 12 or whatever that we have. That's not going to be enough to make it feel like, oh, I'm bringing value to this key outside of just damage. Because for the most part, like, damage balance, that can happen. They can do numbers tuning, but balancing utility is hard. And that's something that I think they need to start as early as possible, whether that's a stun, whether that's giving us like spectral guys. They did add Mind Soothe back into the game in Shadowlands, which we can kind of use as a shroud type mechanic in Shadowlands. So that's actually pretty awesome. I mean, unsure how valuable that will be, or where we can use that specifically. So that's pretty good to see. But I think, like, without having a stun or anything else like a battle res or like a void tendril grip maybe, or something else that kind of homogenizes utility a bit more, because right now
like
if you want to skip like black hole, yeah, exactly, like have something like Ursul's vortex but for priests, or maybe reversed or whatever, right? I think giving that would honestly help even out some of that utility balancing and be able to see it more in higher keys.
I remember once upon a time, Vampiric Embrace was very good. A long time ago. It's not
it's
so
still
good.
really good.
It's not bad now.
It's not what it was before though. Like I remember you'd have 2-3 Shadow Priests pressing that in a raid, and it was just like the raid was just indestructible.
You could just nullify a healer with how strong it was back then. Go
ahead.
I was going to say, I think that the whole Vampiric Embrace being powerful and the lack of the Mind Bomb stun kind of comes into this whole debate of utility being proactive against reactive. Like, do you want to try and heal up the damage after the mobs have all done it? Or do you want to try and create a situation where the mobs never do the damage in the first place? And the whole, like, I want to mass stun this group and kill it before... I want to kill this group in 4 stun DRs and end the pack and leave it there, and then not take the damage in the first place and have the healer DPS in the whole time, compared to we're going to try and eat all this damage and hope the Shadow Priest can out-heal it. It's just not quite the same thing.
And we do have a talent, like I do want to call this out. We have a talent that makes Vampiric Embrace heal for a crap ton, like way more than it does normally. The problem is, to take that talent, we sacrifice our mobility. That row is basically, do you want a movement speed increase when you cast Power Word Shield, or do you want more healing, or do you want to make your defensive better? So we're choosing between survivability, movement speed, or utility for the group there. And I think like that's kind of the stem of part of this problem, is that our choices here are just kind of like, well, I almost always going to take the move speed because I have nothing baseline, and I kind of need that for a lot of stuff. But the keys where I didn't need it, like I could take Sand Lane and get that increased healing, but that was kind of like few and far between. So that choice was just, it was a difficult choice, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't really scale with key level particularly because your damage is kind of semi-fixed. Whereas if you mass stun 12 mobs or mass stun 10 mobs, like they're not hitting your tank for 5 seconds or 4 seconds or whatever. And that scales with the key level because all these mobs hit harder and harder and harder.
Right. And we also do have Shackle Undead. I always forget the spell even exists. We have a CC ability. It's just basically unusable because there's no dungeon that has undead mobs, right?
Well,
King's Rest, yes,
Rest
there's a few. I think there's like 1 or 2 dungeons in Shadowlands that have them, but when you compare that to like Demon Hunter or Paralyze or Polymorph or Sap, like we're kind of dead in the water relative to the other specs. And again, some of these packs, the way that you do them, especially in higher keys, if you don't have a CC, you like can't pull it the same way, and then people are like, well, I can't invite a Shadow Priest because we need the extra CC here for whatever reason, right?
Yeah, it's very much a dungeon is as hard as its hardest pull, and if you're not able to help the group in that pull, you're just not fitting towards the leader's game plan, which is a problem.
Even if you do 1 billion damage, right? Like to a certain extent, like just doing a lot of damage just isn't enough. And I think that's where you were talking about before of like, they almost have to really buff Shadow Priest to make people say, oh, we should really bring Shadow Priest to this key. But I think instead of like thinking about it in terms of just damage, I think it's more about like, what can we give them utility wise that wouldn't like break the game, but just homogenize utility a bit to make it more like, oh, I can bring a Shadow Priest here because it's giving me, a CC and AoE stun, and I can work with that rather than, well, they give me more stamina. So that's it, right?
So
yeah, it's like
so in the realm of kind of reality, then, right? Everybody, I mean, the sky's the limit, right? Everybody wants their specs to be awesome and powerful and have all these things. The thing is, we'll get to the changes in a bit now because there's some great changes here, but I'm not sure amongst all the changes outside of, as you just said, Publik, just pumping a lot of damage into Shadow Priest potentially, that it really solves some of their underlying issues of desirability to be brought to groups, right? Like it really doesn't. You didn't get like a utility. So what is maybe a direction, even if like a thematic direction? I see like in chat a lot of people mentioning like Mana Battery from back in Burning Legion, Burning Crusade, etc. What is a direction, or what do you think is something that they could realistically get, unique or not, that would help their status be more desirable to be brought to dungeons specifically, I'd say, because in raids they have, I think, more of a niche in raids, but even raids as well.
Yeah. There is a spell on a world quest mob. If you, obviously the chat can do this if they want, like in Zuldazar, there is a mob in the northeast corner on the border of Nazmir who is a troll Shadow Priest. And they have an ability where they summon a ball and everything within range of the ball gets slowly dragged towards the middle of it. And it's a black hole-esque ability which kind of fits the Lovecraftian / void themes of Shadow, and is kind of halfway between Sigil of Chains and Urzul's Vortex in terms of what it would do, and it could help with mob clumping and just generally being an effective control tool for tanks. Like if I drop that down and you can just run away, and the mobs are like roughly slowed and won't catch up to you again, you can do like get rid of necrotic stacks or whatever, or just outrange a ridiculously dangerous thing and keep mobs stacked for AoE would be really nice.
And it looks awesome.
It does look pretty cool, that ability, yeah.
I think aside from that, like the things I mentioned before with, making Mind Bomb stun again would be great. And like maybe giving back us like certain spells that we used to have, like Spectral Guise. I think having some talent that maybe augments Shackle Undead to work on maybe more than just undeads, whether that's like a priest that's like performing an exorcism on a humanoid, for example. Like, I don't know what it would be, right? But and I think like really putting back some, because they really did, and we'll go over it in a second, but they did a number on our talent tree. I think I've been complaining about our talent tree not having great like DPS choices for a while, and I think they've done a pretty interesting job with that with these changes. But I wish that we had kind of that same experience dealt with those kind of utility rows that we have, to maybe choose a better Shackle Undead, maybe this dark hole ability, maybe mind bomb stun or something else like that. And I think any combination of those would be great.
I did that black hole sounds amazing. That'd be really cool.
It's you can go onto Wowhead and check the mobs like a bit like actual spells. It's literally a coded spell that already exists. You can have it cast on you if you like, if you go and find the mob.
Neat. So we touched on it earlier. Ramp, right? Ramp as a damage metric. We don't have to spend too long on this because we kind of already touched it. Is very problematic for the kind of go nature that Mythic Plus puts you in of constantly rifling through.
It doesn't work
And
particularly
raids.
well in raids either, because obviously, having being a Mythic progression raider at this point, boss fights are not the same intensity throughout. There are points where things really matter and points where things barely matter. And if you're not able to have your damage ready for the points where things really matter, then your damage is not particularly relevant across the fight anyway, given that's the hard part that you're actually trying to push through. So this whole, like, I start now and my damage comes in a minute, given nothing happens between now and that minute, is not particularly well designed for WoW's encounter design or the way the game wants to challenge players in the first place.
Especially considering we're the only spec in the game that functions like this, right? So like, if the fight doesn't work for that, it's only really hurting us. So I don't think they're super incentivized to make it work, right? So like, I think Mythic N'Zoth, or just N'Zoth in general, is like one of the perfect examples of this, where you have certain phases where the boss is vulnerable, whether it be Psychus or N'Zoth himself, and if you don't time your void form right, you just don't do any damage, right? And that can be a sense of skill for some players to get that timing right. But I think the worst part of it is that it makes the spec really punishing, right? Because if you get some unavoidable mechanic where you have to go handle something and you lost your void form, well, there goes all of your damage that you spent a minute ramping up to. And I think that really became the problem, is that, Shadow Priests have always kind of been fighting this encounter design type of stuff, right? And the same thing happens in Mythic Plus, right? Like and there are several dungeons like this that have like RP phases, right? Where you're kind of just sitting around waiting for something to happen, whether in the middle of a fight or like in between packs. And that just killed all of our damage. Whereas other classes, and just about every class in the game, was just like, oh, well, I get to, wait for my cooldown to come up, or maybe I'll hold my cooldown for 30 seconds and use it for that vulnerability phase or whatever. And we've just never been, there have been very few and far between encounters designed around, oh, you have something to hit the entire time, where we really needed the damage.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some other specs that have a ramp-up mechanic, or some ramp-up mechanics, like Athlock, a bit of Frost, some people mentioned as well. But you're certainly not nearly as badly punished once your kind of like void form phase goes away. Like, you really have to start bottom of the barrel then.
I think the way I tend to describe it to people is void form, in terms of the encounters that Shadow is good at, are the multi-odd encounters, like your Zakuls, your whatever the boss was before Zakul in Eternal Palace that I've forgotten the name of. Queen's Court, yes, thank you. Your Queen's Court. So your targets spread apart from each other, taking damage at the same time, and your melee and your cleave casters can't really hit both at once. But a lot of the value that Shadow has from that comes from the spells it's always had, because Shadow is ultimately a dot spec, and dot specs tend to be good at this sort of thing. So void form is sort of this mechanic the spec has to overcome in a way, in order to eventually do damage. Ultimately, N'Zoth is a fight where it looks very daunting, and obviously there is a lot of awkwardness between trying to do good damage in phase 1, but it kind of works out okay in the end, and there are players who have managed to optimize the timings and get the whole void form thing to line up well enough, but it never quite feels like it gets there in terms of how it should feel to be playing this cleanly on that encounter, compared to your Fire Mages, your BM Hunters, your Destro Warlocks, your Frost DKs, etc. And especially down in Psychus, where cooldowns matter immensely because of the increased damage taken that the guy takes during the phase.
Fair. I don't know if you guys have seen the beta servers, but there are a million.
Lots of Shadow Priests, huh?
There's a lot of Shadow Priests. It's quite cool looking.
As much as Shadow Priest is kind of wavering its popularity, I think it's always been a very fun spec to play, or one of the most fun range specs to play, and I think it's always attracted a lot of people because of that. And especially in raiding, our damage historically from the past 2 expansions, at least the last time I checked, has been like among like top 2 or 3 specs overall.
I think we checked logs historically across the entire thing, and Shadow was the most overtuned spec across the entirety of the past 2 expansions. Yeah. And that was judging logs. Obviously, logs are not the be-all end-all of DPS, and I'm sure Sloot can rant for days about that, given he is.
This is about you, not me.
I mean.
But
I mean, as a raid leader, I'm sure you have your comments about DPS valuing damage above all else. But yes, logs are not the be-all end-all of DPS, and how your spec deals damage in a fight is also really important. But Shadow's overall damage across the entire of the past 2 expansions has been the highest, and that's something we can't really ignore in the whole asking for Blizz to do better for us in certain aspects of the game, because it does. To some people, it does feel a bit unwarranted, but once you understand like why Shadow does what it does and what the issues genuinely are, it kind of feels a bit better in that regard.
Man, apparitions look amazing now. There's like an army of them.
I am looking at a stream right now. This is
there's no way this doesn't get nerfed, by the way.
This reminds me of Legion
Beta.
They
just got their toys.
This reminds me of Legion Beta.
Okay, so we've hit the bases of what the issues with Shadow Priests are. Now, obviously, part of the reason we're talking, outside of course all being chaps here, is the major changes that came in. So let's dive into those and spearhead them, and go over just kind of bit by bit with them, what your guys' thoughts are on them, and then just kind of culminate the general feeling of the changes that they made for Shadow. I'm sure you guys are pressing your buttons away as well, in the meantime, exploring them.
Yep.
So they decided to tackle voidform, Devouring, Plague. A crap ton of talents got changed, removed, added, etc. Some talent rows changed, a couple new spells, and a PvP thing, which we don't need to talk about. So the first major thing was that, which completely counters, or I don't want to say completely counters, but seems to counter the issue a lot that was mentioned, voidform. No longer a spender, go crazy, try to maintain your insanity thing. It is just now a clean 90-second cooldown, 15-second duration, 20% damage increase. It changes into Void Bolt during it, and it's just, that's all it is now. Thoughts on that?
Given I'm an old school Shadow Priest, and I've enjoyed the spec for a good while through many different iterations, I'm quite happy to see the spec return relatively to its roots. However, I do have one slight concern with this idea of Voidform now being a cooldown, and that's that Shadow has, despite 90-second cooldowns being a very unique thing, honestly, I don't think any other spec has a base 90-second cooldown. But Shadow has never been a spec that's particularly relied on cooldowns, and a lot of people who play it kind of are attracted to the idea that they will always be able to do relevant damage, regardless of whether they have this magic button up or not. We don't, on the scale of like Legion Shadow Priest to Fire Mage, in terms of how reliant a spec is on its cooldown, we kind of want to land somewhere in the middle to lower end, and I'm worried that gaining Voidform as a cooldown, Shadow Fiend as a cooldown, and Power Infusion as a cooldown could possibly put us at this sort of like more cooldown reliant end. But ultimately, I am very happy that the spec is kind of going back to its pre-Legion roots.
Yeah, I think it, like, from a versatility perspective, I think this gives the spec just way more options to thrive in situations where we didn't previously. And I think the other big thing, which again has mixed feelings and reactions from the community, it definitely feels like we're going to go back to much more of a dot management spec than we have been, especially over the last 2 expansions. Like, we've basically, ever since the redesign, we basically put up our dots and they get infinitely refreshed passively. All we have to do is redot new targets, and that's about it. With all these new changes, since we don't have access to Void Bolt all the time anymore, we're definitely returning back to the roots of, no, your dots are important. That's where your damage is coming from. Like, you have to care about them and actually put them on targets regularly. So I think it is going to be a little different than what we've had in the past. But I think, like, all in all, that with all the changes to our talents and everything, I'm hoping it gives us enough options to basically still have answers to these problems that get thrown at us in raids, which is like, hey, maybe I want more consistent damage for this phase. Okay, maybe I'll take this talent, or hey, maybe I actually do want the burst damage here. I'll take this or this and that, or whatever. And I think we have more answers to those things that, you know, historically we have been great at, but haven't had the options that we do now. So
so kind of to fill that, well, I mean, what it does is, you know, you guys had issues with the prior design of we don't have a cooldown to crank damage. It's annoying to kind of have people play around us and have a, you know, a tank that knows us really well pull around us. So at least from that perspective, it seems that this void form change fixes that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the maintenance of dots will be interesting. Ellipsis, go ahead.
I mean, a lot of people do have the dot maintenance aspect. I don't
I like it.
enjoy it as much as I did when we had snapshotting, because obviously it had a lot more thought put into it at that point. But the feeling of being what has predominantly been a dot spec, and on a single target 5-minute fight, applying both dots once does seem
a little weird.
Has been a bit strange. Yes, definitely. I'm looking forward to going back to a world where my base spells feel like they matter, and they don't have to be amplified through this lens of a constantly ramping void form in order to make them work or be strong. But I am a little bit worried that things might go the other way, go a little bit too far the other way. Anyway, that's my bit for now.
yeah, and we'll get to this in a second, right? But they are kind of leaving a weird version of void form still in the game as a talent. So you know, there might be, and you know, who knows how that's going to get balanced or whatever. So there is kind of still that other side of Shadow that is like less cooldown reliant. So depending on how they get the balancing here, like it could actually be pretty sweet to be able to choose between, hey, I want to cool down and force my damage into this shorter burst period, or I want to do a bit more consistent damage across a pull, but like less spiky overall burst, right? And you know, they still have things like a version of Surrender to Madness in the game, which I think, like this paired with, you know, returning to our roots as a dot class. I mean, personally, I'm very intrigued to try this out, especially in raid testing later this week, just to see how it feels. So,
oh, the new STM plus that could be pretty interesting with void form.
Yeah, because surrender, you basically get to, like, you know, void form is now a cooldown, yes, but now with surrender, we get to use our cooldown effectively more often, right? So we get to go in and out of that cooldown around surrender and void form. So there is, so we'll see. I mean, it's still kind of weird to play with. I think the last time I checked, it has some weird interactions, but it has potential.
It does somewhat feel like a relic of the, again, legitimately, those two talents both feel like legacies of the void. Tons, but they both feel like things that have been here since the Legion BFA changes, that are there to work with how old void form worked, and don't really fit into the grand scheme of how Shadow is going to work going forwards. They might be very powerful because of that lack of cohesion, but they could also be incredibly bad because of that lack of cohesion. So I feel like that's something that definitely needs to be revisited in future iterations of this design.
Do you think you'll ever get to a position where you get so much stat that Legacy of the Void causes you to just have like bonkers uptime on
as far as
possible.
It's possible. Correct me if I'm wrong. Legacy of the Void, when you take that talent, void form still has a 90-second cooldown.
Correct. Yeah, that's why I'm asking.
Okay.
Like, it's how long can you keep it before its cooldown's refreshed?
It's going to be a tuning issue. The kind of weird concern about Legacy of the Void is obviously it turns void form back into what it is on live and what it was in Legion. Okay. So it just turns off Devouring Plague while it's up. And depending on how strong Devouring Plague is, that's just going to be too big a downside to ever consider this talent.
Because, like, and if you don't know, like, Devouring Plague is the new dot that costs insanity, which, you know, we've already been talking about on beta for the past couple months of, like, how it's really weird to have a spender inside of void form where you're, like, we were previously trying to get, like, maintain high stacks and cast this dot, and, like, keeping that up was just very difficult, and they kind of always fight each other. So that problem still exists here, and at that point, it's just, like what you're saying, scaling is going to be weird, right? If you would have asked me in BFA, I wouldn't have foresaw what we have now coming, right? You know, because we all have corruption in BFA that we have basically infinite stats, whatever we want, which is just insane to see. So I don't think we'll see that again. I think they probably learned our lesson of giving us infinite stats.
They've learned their lesson stats for now, I think, hopefully.
But yeah, we'll see.
So speaking of, because you guys touched on it, I was going to get to it right now. Devouring Plague. Concerns that Ellipsis, for instance, just had were that now that we don't have this kind of always half on gameplay to us anymore, where we can deal at least a moderate amount of damage at all times. You're worried that outside of your burst cooldown windows, tuning aside, of course, you might be a bit weaker. So Devouring Plague was just buffed another 50% damage to also offset the fact that it's now a 6-second duration for its dot duration, and is made basically to be your main spender outside of taking one of the new talents, which we'll talk about in a bit. What do you guys think about that?
It hits really hard, like right now. Like if you look at all these numbers right now, it hits. If I was to just speak roughly in terms of Mind Blasts, I think it does about 7 Mind Blasts worth of damage. And if you think Mind Blast was our regular nuke for this does 7 times the amount of damage that did. So tuning is a bit out of whack, let's say, right now. But
Slightly.
Yeah, slightly. I'm concerned about the point we get to post-alpha, post-release, post-tuning in the raid, where it's like, oh, you get this big spike of damage because all your cooldowns are up. Therefore, we have to lower everything else. That concerns me. And ultimately, how strong Devouring Plague is right now isn't particularly relevant to that end concern. But yeah, Devouring Plague is this new spell that we have to kind of turn us into a regular builder spender in the way that Balanced Druids, Ellie Shamans were, Warlocks, etc. Kind of this whole, like, kind of the modern WoW design, I guess you'd call it. And the fact that it's Devouring Plague, the fact that it's 6 seconds long, kind of harkens back to the previous design of Warlords and Mr. Pandaria in a way, where we had a resource bar, and about 2/3 of it was the cost of Devouring Plague at the time, and it gave you a plague every kind of between 6 and 11 seconds, depending on whether there were how many targets there were or what talents you picked. So it's kind of got that same vibe to it, but it is definitely different enough to the point where this is going to take a new lens and a new perspective to look at it, and not just say whether this is Warlords or not, and whether it's better or not. It's just something different.
Yeah, and I think, like, honestly, it's exciting. I mean, I think I was in the camp of I'd like to see a version of Devouring Plague, and I think before all these changes, I was really scratching my head, because playing that old spec, especially in a raiding environment, literally felt like you're driving 80 miles an hour down the highway, but you're also pressing the brakes down the entire time because you're constantly, like, trying to go the other way with Devouring Plague. But now, you know, I feel like this is kind of the full version of what maybe they were thinking about before, and that, you know, we have this, you know, traditional builder spender again, but it still has multi-target potential. And I think part of the talents also solve some of the downsides of, like, because Devouring Plague is still just a single target spell, right? It is just a dot. We can put it up on multiple targets, but since it's kind of short, we can't maintain it on multiple targets as easily because it does cost a lot. But we have options in the tree to kind of help with that a little bit. But overall, I think it's exciting.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's something new. It's a new direction to move forwards into, and we should be excited to make it the best version of what it is that it can be.
Absolutely.
And instead of getting hung up on whether it's the thing we had just now or how similar it was to what we've had in the past.
Well, I mean, if it gives you any comfort with your worry of, you know, they're going to tune us around our cooldowns, I mean, of course they will, right? It's like, welcome to how 85% of the specs work now. They'll have to tune around those kind of things. But yeah, I mean, going from a class that virtually had, I mean, you had like a cooldown, I suppose, Mindbender, to now having 3.
Bender is never, it's not a cooldown.
Well, let's call it half a cooldown. To having 3 now, plus some other things you could spec into, it's a pretty daunting change.
That lack of sustained damage outside of your magic buttons is definitely something that worries me.
Especially, and I think part of this is also recovering from BFA a little bit. We got nerfed like 5 or 6 times in the course of BFA, and I think that really made our, like, part of our kit be less valuable than maybe it should be. Like, when we were doing raid testing last week, like, dots were like 10%, 15% of my damage overall, and it was mostly all Devouring Plague and other things. So I think, you know, part of this can easily be kind of tweaked and, like, fix the numbers a little bit to make it make a bit more sense, and kind of bring some of that dot class back, so they can, you know, definitely rework things to make it fit. I think there's a lot of potential here.
Shadow gained a lot of power from the Azerite traits and borrowed powers that we've had throughout BFA, and they also had a habit throughout the expansion of sort of nerfing the base spec to compensate for increasing borrowed power. Like, as you gained more eye level, your Azerite traits got better, but Shadow's Azerite traits affected dots, and then they nerfed our base dots to compensate for that. So we've had it all ripped away at once, it feels like, when you've just, like, your dot damage has been nerfed by 68%, I think, across the course of one expansion.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Welcome to borrowed power.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's...
So let's nail some of the quick base changes here. We don't have to spend too much time on some of these because some of them we've already talked about. Void Eruption reduced 40% cast time now because it's a 90-second cooldown. We talked a bit about Devouring Plague. It can critically hit now, and I think it had some haste scaling issues or something earlier too.
It wasn't acting like a dot.
Right.
It was just 12 seconds. Here's damage. It wasn't critting. It wasn't scaling with haste. It was acting very much like a dot would in TBC.
Right, and they've fixed that up. Mind Blast rank 2 now reduces Mind Blast by 7.5 instead of 7 because you had like a half
So
GCD
great.
issue, right? There, something like that.
That was such a weird change.
We've been
Such a
yelling about this
weird
for
problem.
months.
Well, there you go.
I'm so glad they fixed this. I mean, if anything, this shows they were listening, which I'm very thankful for. So.
One that I do kind of want to spend a second on here, because I'm just curious on your guys' thoughts. Period. Shadow or Death. Now no longer increases insanity. I think they've gone back and forth a few times over this over the alpha beta, but just in general, this current design of Shadow Word Death that reflects 100% of the damage back onto you, as you guys mentioned. Obviously, there's tons of bosses, including the first one in Mists of Tyrannus Scythe, that has a 200% damage increase taken window. I've seen priests almost kill themselves on it several times.
It's very fun in Torghast.
Yeah, true. Oh, yeah, that's right. What are you guys' thoughts on this design or kind of reiteration of Shadow Word Death the way it is now?
In the blue post that Blizzard made when they kind of spoke briefly about Shadow of Death, they described it as a situational ability, not something that you press on cooldown regardless of what's going on around you. When Shadow of Death did 210% spell power, which is like 2 Mind Blasts, and generated 15 insanity, it was a button that was better in execute, but it was still just, whenever it was available, it was always the best button to press. So in terms of how your rotation felt between execute and normal rotation, it wasn't at all different, and the spell was not behaving as a situational ability. So I'm assuming this is Blizzard trying to like direct the spell back towards its core purpose of hitting things that are under 20% health and not really much else. It's still reasonably useful if you have to move, and it's got its PvP implications of breaking CC, which I'm sure a lot of PvPers are very happy about. Not particularly relevant for Mythic Plus or raids, but still I'm very happy that they've made those changes for them. But Blizzard wanted to push the spell towards something we want to use on targets under 20% health, and realistically not much else. And this seems like one more step towards making that a thing now.
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging spell to balance, to be able to like hit all the things Ellipsis was just talking about, because I want a very powerful executability, but it can't be too good to want to use it all the time. But it can still have situational value to use it if like I want to move, or I'm out of things to do, so I press it, whatever, right? And I think like they're trying to find that line, and it's a very hard line, whether it becomes like just feel like an instant cast Mind Blast, or actually feels as meaty to press as like a Warrior's Execute, for example. And I think because they could just say, you know what, you can only use it below 20%. It hits like a truck. There you go. But I think they're trying to like weave in some like levels of skill of how to use it, which I think is interesting. But I think like the biggest thing that they're trying to address maybe with this change, because they did just fix its damage a little bit. The fact that it can kill us is still pretty daunting. I think they should overall just cap the amount of damage it can do to the priest.
I believe they have.
Have they capped it? They talked about capping it. I don't see it in these notes, but I guess we should test that out. Especially like in Torghast or whatever we were just saying. There are a lot of mobs that also just don't die, and we get the damage dealt to us if it doesn't kill the target.
I crit myself for 4.7 million. It wasn't fun.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah. So, and there are a lot of mobs in Torghast that like don't die; they go to 0 health. But in terms of Shadow Word Death, like they haven't died, so that means you take the damage, right? So there's a lot of weirdness with that. But I think overall, I've always liked the ability as an execute. It does kind of button overload the spec a little bit because we have so many baseline tools now. But I think over
20 seconds.
Yeah, I think overall, I think it's fine. I personally like having like that execute. I just want it to feel as meaty and impactful as other executes do in the game. So, and I think we're getting there.
Okay. One other big change, which is very cool to see here while we're at the dummies, or one of the final baseline changes, Shadowy Apparitions. The effect has been reworked. When you use Mind Blast, Devouring, Plague, or Void Bolt, you create your own ghostly copies that move towards all enemies affected by your VT and deal damage to them from dark magic. On a critical strike, 2 apparitions appear. Sounds a bit nuts.
This is less like the old Shadowy Apparitions that we... Oh my god, there's a dog.
There's a dog.
I apologize, there was a dog. I got excited. This is less like the Shadowy Apparitions that we've had in previous expansions, where it procs on a Shadowed Pain crit. And it's more like a reskin of an ability that we used to have during Legion, or like not ability, but like as a artifact trait called Sphere of Insanity. Affectionately or resentfully known as Pew 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 Ball, or something to those degree.
Yes, of course.
To that degree,
Scientific
because it had a very, very annoying and consistently happening sound effect, which was I believe removed in Nighthold, but otherwise had infuriated us for about a year, like about half a year at that point. That kind of tried to take your single target damaging abilities and try and make them a bit more cleave focused in a way. If you could have vampiric touches on your targets, as you can see Salute has in his clip right now, you had ghosts coming at you. Had like not ghosts, but a ball would fire some little void bolts, and they would do a bit of damage to like the targets around it. And that's kind of roughly what they've done here, but they've reskinned it into ghosts to make it not make the same horrible noise.
I mean, it looks absolutely insane, and I know like if any of you have played with the Shadow Priest on live, I mean, it's kind of omitting that because on live right now we have so much crit. We have some Azurite traits that are bumping our crit up and all this kind of stuff, and we just get tons and tons of spirits out. And I've definitely like either close to crashing my friends' games on like Temple of Shethralis pulls where you have like hundreds of mobs and like you just get millions of spirits. It feels like, and you can
definitely
really hurt the game a little bit. It slows down everything for a bit. So I'm a little concerned that there's almost too many, but because this basically changes it to, because before it's all been RNG around how much crit that we have, and this makes it more like guaranteed or forced to happen, and then giving crits even more on top of that, which is pretty nuts. I think it's interesting, especially if you take it with the talent to make it generate insanity. I'm curious how much pacing this gives the spec, honestly.
Yeah, I like the consistent change, but I am equally concerned by how the sheer amount of clutter this is creating. Like I'm seeing comments in your chat saying, "Please get rid of this. I hate it in dungeons, etc., etc., etc." I hate playing with the Shadow Priest because I literally can't see my screen anymore. It's just all purple ghosts. I do sympathize, but also it's a lot of fun. Get over it.
I mean,
I do agree that it's possibly a bit excessive right now, especially given like how little crit, like that was just a wave of ghosts. Sorry, like how little crit people have on the beta right now, and obviously this is going to scale with crit even still. I'd like to see Shadow's dots be the main way we do damage in AoE, not just dots spawning ghosts. But I'm still up for a bit of flavor. I'm up for a bit of spice. And so this is kind of that bit of spice that's there, and it's less egregiously scaling on crit than it has been in the past, which is nice because obviously being less reliant on your gear or random gear that you get, having exactly the stats you need it to have is always a good thing.
I mean, visual fidelity in general is, I don't know if you guys have seen like Night Fade DK D&D, the bright blue. Like there's a lot of clutter.
Yeah.
It is beautiful. But it's
I genuinely thought the game had added a blue hue to everything. Like, it felt like it was permanently in I was permanently living in CSI New York or something.
Now they did add a new spell density option that's supposed to reduce visual effects by X%.
I see you have shadow quality on ultra high as well.
Well, yes, of course. Look at them. So that'll be something to pay attention to. But yeah, I mean, these they don't bother me. I don't think they're too intense, these spirits. But you know, like you guys were saying, once you get enough stats, haste and crit and everything, which I assume is probably going to be what you still want to stack, or is mastery looking like a good thing now too? We just don't know
mastery
yet.
I kind of want to do a bit of an in-depth on mastery later on, so maybe don't talk about that now. But mastery does not look like a stat we're going to be looking into right now.
Okay.
Like just TLDR, it basically feels like just a worse versatility right now for us. So like, it's not exciting. It's probably going to be haste. It's almost always like what we like as like a dot class or like a haste reducing CDR class. But
Yeah.
where that second stat, whether it's crit or verse or whatever, I'm sure still.
Or it's just going to be some mixture based on what the Sims tell us.
Whatever you, yeah.
Okay. So baseline changes done. New spell, Dark Thoughts.
That was gonna say there was one more. The Dark Thoughts.
For every damage over time you cast on the target, Mind Flay and Mind Seer have a 2% chance to gain a Mind Blast charge and make it instant cast. For the next 6 seconds, Mind Blast can be cast while channeling Mind Flay or Mind Seer. It could stack up to 5 times if it procs several times in a row, just in case you don't want to use it for that moment.
Yeah. This seems like the little bit of like single target rotational spice that they've added in to replace the fact that Void Bolt is no longer a spell we have 90% of the time. Shadow's rotation otherwise is literally just Flay and Blast and refreshing dots. And even I have to admit, as somebody who's played that for 11 years, not really what a rotation in 2020 should look like in a WoW game.
Yeah, so this I think, hopefully, I think the idea with this is to break up the kind of monotonous, I'm just casting a channel forever, and give you something to do while you're either channeling or you want to move. This is the other big thing here. The changes that we got yesterday were a little unclear, but with this proc, you do just get an instant cast Mind Blast that you can use either by itself or while channeling Mind Flay or Mind Seer, which I think is pretty awesome. I'm excited to play with it, especially in like AoE, because before kind of in AoE, we kind of were stuck with the decision, well, you can sit there and just channel this ability, or you can stop channeling and do something else. So I like that there is some kind of interactivity with that. And the fact that you can bank up charges, although it is kind of like a short window to bank them up, is interesting, especially adding to that kind of burst.
It's going to depend on the proc rates, like how the consistent proc rate of it feels across a geared character with a bit more haste.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it even scales for like multiple targets that you hit with Seer. It might not. That's another question.
I believe it's supposed to. I don't know. Like I've heard comments that like it seems like it's meant to do that, and maybe it does or it doesn't right now. But I'm slightly concerned about how much better it is on multi-targets. Obviously, we have talents now that explicitly make Mind Blast better in AoE. So I'm worried about how much Mind Blast gets better in AoE.
Psychic Link, right? We'll get to that in a bit.
Psychic Link.
It's I mean, just like playing here, not even doing a proper rotation, just listening to you guys talk, it was doing like insane amounts of damage on those 4 dummies there.
And like, keep in mind right now, we also have a Conduit in the game, and you know, obviously subject to change. There's a Conduit in the game that a Mind Blast cast has a chance to proc a free Devouring Plague.
10%.
I think it's a 10% fixed thing, right? So they're adding like a very significant amount more Mind Blast into our rotation with this passive and all these other changes, to where not only you're getting out instant cast Mind Blast, but now you also can proc free Devouring Plagues. The spec has a chance to be a monster to play with and just kind of lighting up with procs everywhere, which could be really fun. It could also be overwhelming or maybe a little broken. So
it gets a bit weird once you start to get a proc of Devouring Plague faster than every 6 seconds, because obviously the dot takes 6 seconds to its full damage, so kind of end up wasting the Devouring Plagues. If you recap in that amount of time, it doesn't look particularly common right now, but alongside in AoE, alongside all those sort of things, in AoE you can probably put on multiple targets, but on single target, if you have really high haste during Lust or whatever, and the stars roughly align, I guess, or just the proc rate's decent, and you have the Devouring Plague proc Conduit as well, it does look like there's going to be the opportunity to be I have 100 Insanity and literally nothing to cast, which is a bit of a worry, but it's a minor worry at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, to get the stars to align, you probably have to play a Boomkin anyway. Let's talk about the talent changes here just for a moment. Because this is, I guess, where a lot of the bread and butter of the changes came in, and that's why I said we'll get to which was it? One of the new ones. I forgot the name. Psychic Link in a moment. So the level 15 now, we have Shadowy Insight gone, Shadow Word Void gone, Death and Madness is now available at this level, and for those who don't know what that is, it's the one, if a target dies within 6 seconds after being struck by Shadow Word Death, you gain 40 Insanity over 4 seconds, and the cooldown of your death is reset. And a new talent, Unfurling Darkness. After casting Vampiric Touch, your next VT is instant and deals 155% of your shadow damage immediately. This effect can be triggered no more than once every 15 seconds. What are you guys' thoughts on this talent row now? Public, go
I mean,
ahead.
I want to make
Ellipsis, go ahead.
weirdly non-relevant point, but the fact that these talents are now here kind of means that Shadow Priest is a completely fleshed out spec by level 20, because now we have Shadow of Death and Vampiric Touch, and like all of our kit that was not this early on leveling wise is just all there, which I know is not relevant to most people, but if you're planning to play a Shadow Priest, being able to have access to all your buttons that are interesting very early on is kind of cool.
Yeah.
From there onwards, Shadowy Insight is gone because it's been replaced by Dark Thoughts. Shadowed Void is gone because voidform now grants you a second charge of Mind Blast while it's active. And the reason that Shadow Priests were so focused on Shadowed Void was that it prevented Mind Blast from coming off cooldown at the exact same moment as Void Bolt did. If anyone is a Fury Warrior or a BM Hunter throughout Legion, they will remember exactly what this feels like. Trash, by the way.
Yeah. I think overall, they did an amazing job with the talents. I think we have some really great choices here. I think there are some still oddballs here. Like, I'm not quite sure, in a world of all the new exciting things that they've given us, I don't know if Fortress of the Mind is the thing I want to pick, because it's really just like a numbers thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
Want that or not.
Yeah,
but
I think that talent row now looks like Fortress of the Mind, Death and Madness, and I believe this new thing in Furling Darkness. So yeah, like the rows look very different to how they did. Like, I'm sure Publik would like to.
Yeah, I know. I think these are interesting choices. We're effectively saying, and again, I'm gonna plug it here because I really want this fixed. Death and Madness has been like impossible to test because what it does is once you use Shadow or Death on an enemy, if they then die like X seconds later, I think it's 6 right now, Shadow or Death cooldowns reset, and then you get some insanity back. Unfortunately, it doesn't work right now. If you kill your target, like one-shot them, it doesn't reset the cooldown of death, which is just like almost the entire point of it. So it's hard to tell like how useful that will be. I have a feeling this is going to be like potentially like really awesome and fun to play with, especially in like a dungeon environment, to basically just like execute a ton of stuff in a row and kind of chain off that execute. So very interesting. And I think Unfurling Darkness as well, giving us free vampiric touches, is going to play off like incredibly with how the spec plays right now with, making sure we have VT on every target for like a few talents down the row. So that has some monster combinations. I think before, if you ever played a Shadow Priest, our talent tree was almost 100% set in stone. We changed like maybe 1 or 2 talents over the course of the entire expansion. That was
Misery or Twist.
Yeah, Misery or Twist, and then we took Dark Ascension for a period of time, but like that was really it. So I mean, overall, I'm pretty pumped about like actually having like real choices back into the talents.
Definitely.
Isn't there any concern with Death and Madness that you just like rifle yourself and kill yourself?
That is indeed a concern. That like if there are like 4 or 5 targets in a row that are Death and Madnessable, as long as you one-shot the target, you're not going to take the damage yourself. You only take the damage if you don't kill it. But if you don't kill it and then it dies afterwards and it's within the 4 seconds and you get it back, there is a bit of a worry that like 4 or 5 Shadow of Deaths that don't quite kill the target in a row is just going to kill you. Especially in an affix like Bursting or specific raid encounters where mobs tend to die and do raid damage when they die, which is kind of a very common thing. I'm sure everyone knows. It is a bit concerning, especially if I was, for example, to be a cheesing piece of derogatory, and sit there pressing Shadow of Death on every psychophage.
That's the healer's problem.
Yeah, pressing Shadow of Death on every single psychophage is probably going to kill you in pre-patch.
It is also a good note though that the spec now we actually have a ton of self-healing as a Shadow Priest, like even without Vampiric Embrace, with Vampiric Touch, and now Devouring Plague heals us for quite a reasonable amount as well. And I think a lot of our Covenant abilities also give us a good amount of healing. So there is kind of this interesting like dichotomy that we now have of like, well, yes, I'm doing damage to myself. I am somewhat hurting my character, but I'm also healing a lot of that back. So I think it's just it could just be a skill element of like knowing how to control Death and Madness without killing yourself, and then also regenning enough back. So it could be an interesting gameplay loop. But yeah, we'll see.
The worry is like if things take increased damage, and it just like bars us from ever pressing Shadow or Death on that mob. Psychus is a good example, and the bears from the Archer fight that you guys tested. I'm sure Jerv and Publik definitely one-shot themselves on that one.
A few times.
The Unfurling Darkness procs off itself, by the way. I just
if you don't cast if you don't cast Vampiric Touch more often than once every 15 seconds, it basically means VT is instant.
That's pretty cool.
I think that has more PvP implications than PvE, but it's still quite interesting.
What I wanted to note, though, was on the note of Death and Madness and kind of one-shotting and damaging yourself too much. With Devouring Plague being buffed plus VT doing a pretty substantial amount of damage, your self-sustain is actually kind of insane right now. Which is that's a pretty big deal all around, not necessarily rating or I mean, maybe even PvP. Like, that's going to be...
I think the problem with Shadow with Death is you can't out-heal a one-shot.
No, of course not. But even aside from Death and Madness, just generally your self-sustain, you know,
like ticking damage.
Yeah, boss has ticking damage. There's a lot of bleeds coming up in Nathria, etc. So that's a point of reference for sure.
Always feels good to have some sort of like personal thing that makes you more effective.
Level 40, new talent, Psychic Link, which I believe replaced Death and Madness there, if I'm not mistaken. Mind Blast deals 60% of its damage to all targets within 40 yards affected by your VT.
This is really, really strong, and it kind of scares me a bit. Is it? If this is as strong as it looks on AoE, and they have two choices, they can either nerf Psychic Link, or they can nerf Mind Blast. I implore them to nerf Psychic Link before they nerf Blast, because I would love the Mind Blast to hit hard for the first time in 5 years.
It is important to know this was a PvP talent that they've now brought into the PvE world. They did buff it on its way up, I think, because it's only. Yeah, it's only 20% on live right now. So they did a number on this guy. So we'll see if, you know, the numbers stay the same. But I think overall, like, if you pair Psychic Link with our new passive and all this other stuff that we have, this looks like a monster to play with on AoE, and just honestly just looks like a ton of fun. Like, you're getting all these procs of Mind Blast, you're casting Mind Seer, you have Vampiric Touch like procs potentially if you're taking Unfurling Darkness, right? All this stuff. I mean, it's a lot. It's not even that much setup, but man, all the stuff playing together is like just sounds fun to play.
Yeah, it's nice. I have another like one slight concern is like Psychic Link is based on Vampiric Touch, and so is Ghosts, and the other thing in the row is Auspicious Spirits. So I'm not actually sure how I would differentiate when I would use one against the other. It seems like they both do the same thing, and one of them will ultimately do it better. And then Shadow Crash is kind of sitting there as this sort of, like, left out. I don't know, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, not Dark Horse, the opposite, lone sheep or something.
Light
just
horse?
Sitting there, not being particularly effective and not scaling with anything that Shadow is also doing. I guess it's really good in like the 10, 15 target mob count encounters, which do exist, but are not particularly common. So I guess it's good there.
Well, it's a good note, though, right? Because Shadow Crash is an 8-yard range, or how much is it? 8? I think it's 8, right?
Yes.
It's very short range, right? But Psychic Link and Auspicious Spirits is basically infinite, right? You just need to have a dot on the target, right? But Psychic Link is 40 yards, right? So they're like I don't know, like Shadow Crash's use case is kind of weird right now because, you know, I'd rather have damage on all targets within range rather than just the ones that are clumped and stacked. Especially because, you know, having any ability like Shadow Crash that is a targeted missile, like it does have a travel time, right? Is always weird, right? Because, you know, any boss fight or whatever where like a target, I think one of my favorite fights that we did on the raid was the council fight where you're doing the dancing. One of the bosses there just like randomly leaps away all the time at a targeted location. So Shadow Crash is not fun there. So we have other options now, which is great. It's just I don't know if Shadow Crash can compete anymore.
Yeah, the 40 row looks like it comes less down to what's useful in a specific situation and more of just a numbers game.
Especially with the change to Auspicious Spirits, like
Auspicious Spirits
that could feed into that pretty hard.
It comes off VT now, which is what Psychic Link comes off, so they kind of work the same way. It also feels weird that it feels like the single target choice on this row is Shadow Crash, when it feels like it's explicitly meant to be the mass AoE choice.
Yeah, I feel like they added a bunch of obviously rework talents and stuff, and didn't really give heed to the other talents that haven't been touched yet. In light,
Yeah,
of
it does
the
feel
old
like
ones.
there's some like legacies of the void. Puns.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
fun note someone brought up. Apparently, it's bugged right now, and it actually casts Mind Blast on any target with Vampiric Touch, even if it's not your Vampiric Touch.
Oh, that must be fun with 15 people around the train.
Assuming that's a bug right now, but just to call it if you're testing it, a little different than it probably should be.
Noted.
Okay, cool.
I think something that's very important to note as well for Shadow, especially because we were just talking about Psychic Link a moment ago. In a world where, and this is kind of an indirect buff to Shadow Priests, in a world where we now have the issue / hot topic of AoE capping for a lot of people, to have an uncapped class and have dots be so quickly and powerfully applied everywhere. Psychic Link seems to not have a cap. Does Mindseer have a cap?
Mindseer does not have a cap.
Mindseer does not have a cap.
Shadow Crash doesn't.
The Shadow Priests and Balanced Druids of the world are salivating at current Mythic Plus scenarios.
That is a kind of indirect passive strength that this spec now has that a lot don't at the moment.
It would be cool if we ended up in a situation where the triple DPS choice for Mythic Plus is you bring one uncapped DPS, one strong cleave DPS, and one single target DPS, and kind of split the roles that way. In that case, then Shadow Priest is only really competing with like 2 or 3 other specs in terms of.
I think that's kind of Blizzard's desire to live in a world where they've created niches. That's why they're doing this whole AoE cap thing. They're trying to create niches. I'm a bit hesitant on how successful they're actually going to be with that. I think it might cause more problems than it's worth. But nonetheless, the reality that they're trying to enforce on us gives a huge benefit to Shadow Priest now as well.
Yeah, it does.
Let's talk about the 45 row, because this one had a lot of changes as well. Lingering Insanity, gone. Dark Void is gone. New talent, Searing Nightmare. Instantly inflicts shadow damage to all enemies near the target and applies Shadow Word Pain to them. If the enemy is already affected by your pain, Searing Nightmare deals double damage. Can only be cast while channeling Mindseer.
I don't believe this is correct, actually. Can you just open up your character so I can see it in beta, please?
It's not actually on here, you're right.
Yeah, it's not connected correctly. It's Searing Nightmare is down with... Searing Nightmare is in the 30 row.
Yes,
alongside Twist of Fate and Misery, because it essentially replaces Dark Void, but it is Dark Void without a cooldown that does a lot of damage.
Yeah.
It's your AoE spender in the spec now for Mythic Plus.
Right.
Instead of just pressing Devouring Plague constantly, you're going to be searing with dots up. You're going to maybe apply a couple of VTs, but you're going to be sear spamming and then mashing Searing Nightmare to spend your insanity. So it's just a better Dark Void.
Then it's nice to have optional spenders, by the way. I wonder, it's probably going to be I assume just like other classes have, like, X and above targets, you're using Searing instead of DP kind of
Searing
thing.
Nightmare looks like a 5 to 6 target kind of thing, and then Misery looks like a 3 to 4 target kind of thing, and then Twist of Fate looks like a priority damage kind of thing. And I'm glad that they do split up in that very AoE cleave single target kind of division, which is nice.
So then in the 45 row, correctly this time, Damnation is new. Instantly and at no resource cost, hits the target with Shadow Word Pain, Vampiric Touch, and Devouring Plague on a 45-second cooldown. And Void Torrent itself changed a bit. No longer pauses Insanity Drain on cast, but now refreshes the duration of your shadow damage over time effects while channeling. And I think that's still on a 1 minute, so 45-second cooldown as well. So you have 2 45-second cooldowns, one brand new, one slightly changed, and Mindbender still there as well.
I think Mindbender is Mindbender is like the single target sustain option over like a long period of time, and then Damnation feels like it's trying to be the multi-target option, and Void Torrent is the I need to hit this thing now option, which would have been lovely to have on Raden progress.
So a bit of synergy, just to add to your thoughts here with what you're about to say. Damnation has been noted by a lot of people in chat that it also synergizes with Unfurling Darkness. With the free VT casts. Go ahead,
it does. That's quite nice.
I think I was also like, Void Torrent's interesting in that, we do have a spell in the next row, Legacy of the Void, that says, I'm going to go into Void Form now. And, we have a certain amount, so we have our base Void Form cooldown. And I think that might give Void Torrent a bit more oomph as well. But, because is it generating Insanity? The spell change said it wasn't
60.
supposed to.
60, it says.
Okay.
Void Torrent is big now. It's like
I don't know if that's
full
true.
Devouring Plague.
in the changes yesterday, they said Void Torrent was changed to not generate insanity. I thought
It doesn't pause.
It doesn't freeze your
it doesn't
sanity
pause
drain.
the drain. Okay, that's what it was. Okay, got it.
Because there's no drain anymore unless you play Legacy, so it doesn't pause
Right.
anymore.
Right.
But it does generate 60 now, which is like a lot of insanity generation. At least on one ability. Like that's honestly hitting really quite hard now in terms of how much damage it does and how much resources you get and how much damage that's worth.
Right.
You'll always be
still-
able to line up a Void Torrent with a within a Void Form cast, right? Every single time.
I'm
Just-
mildly concerned about how much borrowed power is affecting Mindbender with the legendary, the Conduit, and the Nightface Soulbind.
Yep.
Yeah, are all affecting Mindbender. So we're still kind of a little bit worried that this row is just Mindbender or bust for the entire expansion, regardless of what content you're doing. But realistically, this row does look a lot better than it has done. Especially now Lingering Insanity is gone, because that was like the be-all, end-all
Trainwreck.
for the entirety of any time it existed.
Yeah, and I think I'm expecting changes to a lot of the things that give Mindbender so much oomph right now. There's a legendary that brings it down to a 36-second cooldown, which is pretty incredible. And then there's conduits that buff its damage and attack speed. And then the Fey Blessings guy, which Ellipsis just mentioned, are what's right now. I don't know if it's been changed yet. I guess we need to go pick Night Fae to find out. Void Bolts reduce the cooldown of like 5 allies' major abilities. Although it's not guaranteed to go on the Priest right now. If it does go on a Priest, it reduces our Mindbender even further. So there's a lot of things kind of cascading together, like buffing Mindbender a lot more than it probably should, considering it's a talent. So I fear that might make the other two options, just like totally null and void because of that just kind of amazing synergy. So we'll see.
Could use
Null and
the word
void.
there.
Tons.
Null and void. There you go.
The final row, level 15. Dark Ascension has been removed. Legacy of the Void has been slightly reworked, as we were just talking earlier, to basically give that what is now classic feel to Void Form, so no longer has a duration, but while you assume Void Form, your madness will begin to drain at an increased rate. When it reaches 0, Void Form will expire, and your spell damage is increased by 5% while in Void Form. It still maintains its 90-second cooldown. Surrender to Madness is now a 90-second cooldown, instead of, I think it was 2 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, before. And a new talent, Ancient Madness. When you cast Void Form, your critical strike chance is increased by 30% for 15 seconds, decreasing by 2% per second. So it basically lasts the entirety of a Void Form cast.
Yeah, it feels like it's kind of a remnant of Chorus of Insanity, which we had previously. It even has the
Probably-
same icon.
Probably a more healthy version.
Yeah,
All things
I
considered,
like
but-
Ancient Madness a lot.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, this makes Void Form like an absolute truck, right? It's giving us 20% increased damage. We get access to Void Bolt. Now we get more crit. I mean, it's pretty beefy, right?
It's only 15%. Let's be real, but yeah, it's
I'm-
30%.
yeah.
It's 30% scaling down.
And then that crit feeds into Spirits with Mind Blast now, and you got
Yeah,
a lot of,
like, it
lot of
does-
synergy.
There's a lot of synergy and a lot of knock-on effects there, and I really do like that button or that talent. I'm quite concerned about the other two. Let's say.
Yeah, I think the design goals of the other two are not as clear to me personally. Like, I think Legacy of the Void, it still has a 5% damage increase, which I think is just kind of dangerous. We've basically been taking Legacy the entire expansion right now because of that. It's a 5% damage boost button. Now that Void Form isn't as big, does it matter as much? Not really. It's kind of just weird. I think ideally, if the purpose is to say I want more consistent damage or not, maybe that's where it fits, but I'm not sure. Surrender to Madness is still super weird to use. I just don't know how useful it's going to be. It's still something that you cast it on a target, you get the benefit, but then as soon as that target dies, you lose all that benefit, right? So I think that's kind of a weird benefit thing. If it was kind of more of like I'm like sniping ad targets similar to how I would do a Shadowy Death, and then I get some benefit after doing that for a while, I think that makes a bit more sense. But I think the risk reward problem with Surrender to Madness is like the worst problem, just because, you know, from a rating perspective or even a Mythic Plus perspective, like there's a very large opportunity cost to just outright dying, which is what this change was in BFA right now. Which again, we still didn't take Surrender to Madness really at all in BFA. It didn't actually kill you. But this change, you know, I don't think Surrender to Madness is worth a potential like bolstering kind of mess up where it's like, oh hey, you can't kill this target because we would bolster this mob or get a bursting stack, or it's a priority ad and it has to die at a specific time. And it's like, well, then Surrender's just not going to be able to be used, right?
I don't think you actually lose your void form once you kill your STM target.
Yeah, it's been changed now. It used to be that Surrender Madness give you a massive amount of insanity generation and put you in void form, but you lost the generation once the target died.
Oh, I see.
You still lose the generation, but the 25-second fixed duration. So still lose the insanity generation, but the 25-second fixed void form that Surrender Madness puts you in, you still get to keep.
Right.
Which kind of makes Surrender Madness on any target, on any fight where there is a target that's going to die, that's not the boss, ridiculously strong, realistically, because it's like having a second cooldown and then some.
Right.
Whereas Legacy of the Void is like, realistically, you might double the length of void form, but you don't get to cast Devouring Plague in it at all because you have to use your insanity to maintain the void form itself. So it may just sort of combat against the spec in the same way that it did in SL Beta before these changes came in, where we had Devouring Plague and void form trying to work against each other. I feel like Legacy of the Void just does the same thing again. And also, because of the changes to void form of removing the stacking haste, removing the sort of power gains from each individual stack of void form that you used to get, it doesn't feel like this version of Legacy of the Void is doing enough for those who really loved the previous gameplay to kind of justify its own existence. Okay, so it's like all the things that we didn't like about that period of void form, and none of the things we liked as an option for those who didn't like those things either. It feels really out of place in terms of whether they're willing to let it be strong in its like given situation, and it provides none of the like really fun aspects that void form used to provide in Legion or BFA, which is obviously got the massive amount of haste, the massive amount of stats, etc., and like the not so much just the fighting against the drain, but the getting faster and faster and faster whilst doing it, which is what's really missing talent right now.
So, gentlemen, given all these net changes and Shadow Priests being in a very meme state, and not even just meme state from the community, but the players themselves. I talked to Jerv a lot, etc., just hating playing it. Finally, it looks like they got a pretty substantial amount of attention. Do you guys think? And I'm gonna pretend to be Twitch chat here for a second. Do you guys think that these changes are good? Are we headed in the right direction here? Obviously, there's always some kind of rough things around the edges with tuning, etc. But do you think that these underlying changes and the rework to void form is what we need for Shadowlands moving forward with the spec?
I think Shadow was in a very strange state where the previous version of the spec was so different from what came afterwards. It created somewhat of a schism in the community, and ultimately, no matter how they moved on from where they were, one side was going to lose. That side seems to have been the void form side, but from my perspective, I think these changes go in a good direction. I'm not quite sold on everything that's happened so far. Obviously, there needs to be some tweaking and tuning, and some talents feel a little bit left out from the previous version, but there is definitely a working core here that could be great for us going forward.
I think these changes are super healthy. I think this is the first time where I don't feel like Shadow's just like a ticking time bomb of like craziness that could like burst at any second. I feel like there's some proper direction to a spec that's just been it kind of felt like we've been ignored for the last couple expansions and not really paid too much attention to. So this feels amazing. I'm not going to take that for granted at all. I think, numbers tuning aside, because, obviously they're still working on that. I think there's a lot to work with here to give Shadow great options and still have like a great niche of whether this uncapped AoE or spread target or really being a dot class again. I think it brings us back to the roots a little bit there, and it looks like it's a lot of fun to play. So we'll see. But
I kind of want to clarify.
I think it's a good direction.
I kind of want to clarify on the talent thing, because obviously the chat's kind of erupted in the whole like our talents aren't viable either. It's like, yeah, I'm well aware of the situation where talents don't feel like they're comparatively good. I love the shake, but yes. It's kind of more like Shadow's talents feel like they don't fit in the spec anymore, in terms of what Legacy of the Void's trying to do, what Surrender Madness is trying to do, and what Shadow Crash is trying to do, really. They just don't feel like they match the buttons that the class now has.
I mean, even for me as a common Shadow Priest plebeian, I've always enjoyed the concept of Shadow Priest, and I really like dot maintenancey things in this game. Like I like Affliction. I don't know, it's just fun for me to play. So these changes, just to me, who like has no idea to the level of depth that you guys do, they just like fun to play. Like genuinely, as a World of Warcraft player,
Right.
it's the stress and irritation of losing a void form when a pull often doesn't go your way in Mythic Plus that was just tied to the spec gives me fun now to not have to worry about that kind of stuff.
It's going to be so much more less punishing for players, especially if you're new to the game or like you just want to try out Shadow Priest. There's not this like giant thing that you have to like learn how to play or whatever. And I think from that aspect, I think that's just a healthier base of a spec to build off of, to add things to augment. And, you know, I think the more that they can make that happen in the rest of the game, I think the better it is. So
yeah, the caveat to that is it's much easier to augment and buff or like change and work and build from if they choose to build from it. Because obviously, like, ultimately the spec is only as good as doesn't make it. So that's a little bit of a concern, but obviously that's kind of minor at this point. I lost my train of thought. Never mind.
Oh, when it comes back to you, let me know.
Will do.
So it looks like things are going in a positive direction. Again, having gone over these changes, I don't think that we've addressed some of the more meta issues, maybe with like utility, etc., that we talked about earlier. We don't have to dive back into it again, but maybe that's something of an overview that they'll kind of look at for all classes and specs, hopefully, as we kind of lead up to the expansion launch. But let's take a step back from not necessarily Shadow Priest, because I want to hear these following questions from the Shadow Priest / Shadow Priest community perspective. But let's talk about, you know, Blizzard's approach to this and why it took so long, knowing that Shadow desperately needed help, especially increasingly so once BFA started. What kind of impacts did their really lack of changes for almost the entirety of an expansion plus, how did that impact your guys' community with Shadow Priests and just, you know, the general gameplay of trying to pug your Mythic Plus for the week, try to get brought to raid, etc., and as a result, the enjoyability of your class?
It was definitely a struggle with the sort of community perception that was built around how people didn't enjoy their spec, regardless of how much damage it was doing, was kind of creating the situation where people didn't want to play with you as much. And also, everybody, I'm sure everyone in the chat right now, has had an experience with a Shadow Priest in a Mythic Plus key where they just felt like a paperweight.
Yep.
And just didn't do anything, really. Shadow is a spec where it's very, like, the minimum damage you can end up doing is very, very, very low compared to somebody who's doing, somebody who's playing like a Demon Hunter or like a more spammy melee, where even if you're not great at the class, you're still going to pop your cooldowns on a big trash pack and do at least something at some point.
Yeah. And I think I think making the spec more like better for entry level players that are just starting to try out and starting to kind of like get rid of the stigma of Shadow Priest kind of issue with damage pattern and keys, like from like the ground up of like, you know, the base level of player to the top end where our AoE is now no longer capped, which is really intriguing, honestly. And I think honestly just having a spec that's like really fun to play, like just inherently fun to play, I think will just attract people that want to play it. And I think we've kind of been struggling with like, you know, what's the purpose of like void form and stacks and everything. But I think with this build, we're starting to get back of like, oh, your purpose is like you have this cooldown again. We have these procs that revolve around the spec, right? And I think that's personally what we needed to give the spec kind of like vision again and kind of bring the community back around, because, you know, it's been kind of like a whirlpool of emotions, I think, in the Shadow Priest Discord for the past, especially the past expansion of like, yeah, we found this build that works, but man, it's really not that fun to play. Or, it's there, but, it was never the Shadow that people remembered playing back in Emerald Nightmare that had this crazy pacing or whatever. So I think people were always either nostalgic for that play style and just never got it back, or they wanted something just totally different. And I think this is a good way to start kind of starting to fix those problems with the spec.
So that being said, because one of the questions we have here, obviously, how do you, one of the issues with kind of being at the brunt, and not just Shadow Priest, right, just in general community perception, we were talking about this earlier in chat as well, of classes or specs that are just so memed and underperforming often and just left in the dust for multiple years at a time. How do you think they can change that perception? Do you think it's on Blizzard onus to change that community perception. Obviously, if they had moved faster, we wouldn't be in the situation either. But so I guess two-part question: why do you think it took them so long? Because seemingly, from what you guys are telling me and from what I hear, this feedback has been hammered for a long time now. It's not anything new that they knew about. So why do you think it took so long? And being in the pickle you are now, what can we do to help the community realize that hopefully, at least with these changes going forward, Shadow is not something that you immediately just glance over in your LFG? Because one thing, as you mentioned, is within the Shadow Priest community, it feels great. It looks like it's fun to play. You know, people are excited, etc. But for people that all they care about is they don't know anything about Shadow Priest. All they know is that Shadow Priest is not good for 2 years. How do we fix that?
I go back to your point of like, why has it taken so long? I think it goes back to the elevator pitch of voidform being such an interesting and conceptually fun thing that it took a pretty deep exploration that obviously we are not privy to. We have no idea what's going on behind Blizzard's closed doors, but it does feel to from our side of things, from like what we've seen changes wise, that there was a long period where they were trying to make voidform work every which way they could think of. And unfortunately, it seems like they've come to the conclusion that that doesn't really exist, given the feedback we've given to them. And whether I agree or disagree with that isn't really relevant. It's happened now. We're here.
I think it's also like, it's really hard to change a spec like Shadow, where there was just, you tweaked one thing and the spec went off the rails. And I think they've been struggling with like, well, we could try this, we could try that. And just like the whole spec just kind of explodes either in their face or in our face. And I think, you know, realizing that is very difficult. And I think getting to a place where it's like, okay, we just kind of need to hit the reset button here to make it. And this was kind of my perspective for a while. If they make a spec that is easier to balance, easier to tune, easier to augment, I think it's a better base of a thing to go into an expansion with, right? Because now they have a base to work with that is healthy. They can do healthy things to make it do more damage, or healthy things to give it a niche. And I think that's what was really lacking. And that's really hard to do, right? And it was also hard because, you know, the community's been split for a while on how to fix this, right? I don't think there was ever any like, oh, this is the golden way to fix Shadow. It's just as easy as this, right? Sure, there are things that they might have tied it over through Shadowlands, but I think at the end of the day, they were always going to make someone upset. And I think that's what they were struggling with, is that, you know, thematically it's a great spec, but how do we handle it in a way that, you know, will make the majority of people think, oh, wow, I really want to play my Shadow Priest today, or I really want to do a key on this week, or man, that guy's playing Shadow and looks like he's doing a lot of damage or having a lot of fun. I see all these spirits everywhere. And I think like giving the spec more moments, it's like, man, I love playing this game. Man, this is fun. I think that's how they make a spec great.
The fact that the community as a whole was so passionate, but also so divided, meant there was a lot of hesitation about how exactly to push forward and what exactly to bring forward from what the spec had in Legion and BFA. Like, what bits of how Voidform played should we sort of package up and attempt to sort of transfuse into some sort of other version of Shadow. And I think that process took a very, very long time in terms of trying to like work out exactly what to bring forward and exactly how to bring it forward.
So moving forward, should, and not just Shadow, right, in general, what do you think could help Blizzard make some of these changes faster? Do you think that it was the kind of disagreements and split amongst the Shadow Priest community that kind of made Blizzard take a while to make these changes because there wasn't a unified voice on what needs to be changed exactly? Or do you think you guys nailed it from the get-go and maybe they were a bit too stubborn trying to make Voidform work and it just didn't work for so long?
I think it was a lot of things, but I also think it's Blizzard's focus on things that aren't class design going through expansions. This sort of focus on borrowed power, sort of plugging the holes that your spec has, and Blizzard trying not to tweak classes that much in between patches or expansions because they kind of want to hope that they can mold the borrowed power things to fix those problems without having to change the base, I guess. But honestly, I think like making sure the foundations are really, really solid should be a priority across all classes and specs. And I think Shadow is just an example of what happens when you don't do that.
Yeah, and I think like, I remember in Legion, I've always had every class kind of more or less at like max level, and Legion was the first time that I was like, man, I really want to try out this spec and this spec, get their artifact ability, see how it plays and stuff. But I think in BFA, I didn't really have that. There wasn't like, oh, I really want to try an Ellie Shaman, or I really want to try, playing Arms Warrior or whatever. And I think going back to that like base class design of like, there's a ton of great feedback posts, and like I know myself and Ellipsis, like I've spent probably days of my life now giving feedback about Shadow Priest just for Shadowlands. And I think a lot of great people from other classes and specs are doing the same thing. And I think it's kind of like it's almost like a struggle from the community perspective. At least this is how I felt. I'm like craving Blizzard's attention of like, at least talk to me about what you guys want to do. Like, what are you thinking about when you're balancing Windwalker? Like, what are you thinking about like these changes? We've gotten some like little paragraph blurbs, and there's been some, I think, solid posts for like balance druids and affliction locks and other changes.
Shadows,
but I think
Shadows were genuinely
it's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think just from my perspective, I would love just more. They used to have like water cooler posts of like, this is what we're thinking about for shamans in the next expansion. This is what we're thinking about for rogues and all this stuff. And I think getting out of this, like no class should feel like they're being ignored. And I think that's what I've personally felt like Shadow has been for like the past couple expansions. And I think, if they took this level of detail to Shadow, just imagine what they could do to Windwalker monks or other classes that aren't feeling like they're having fun playing their spec again without, okay, sure, maybe this one Covenant ability is really fun to play with, but I think at the end of the day, if the base class isn't fun by itself, there's only so much you can do to make it great, right?
Yeah. I know that compared to Publik across his entire interview, I've been a bit of a Debbie Downer in terms of even like all these amazing changes, like amazing seeming changes that have come across, done it again, across Shadow compared to obviously this, oh my god, this is amazing, let's try this out, etc. I genuinely believe that class design needs to be, if not a dialogue, and if not Blizzard like listening to us in that way, obviously like it'd be a kind of narcissistic to believe we're in that sort of position where we are genuinely that valued, but there needs to be some sort of iterative process that isn't just sort of, we put a post up and here's a paragraph about it, and then in a month some changes happen and we're not told why they happened or what bits of feedback related to why they happened, and we just kind of have to keep providing feedback, not really knowing what bits of the spec they currently want to change, how they feel about things themselves, or if something wasn't changed because they don't want to change it, compared to if they just didn't listen to the feedback on it or not. Like, it helps to understand what exactly we should be giving feedback on.
And we don't need to have grand sweeping class changes, right? It's more just about like we're just asking like Blizzard, like, what are you thinking here? Like, what's the goal here? And I think like a lot of the interviews that you've done with the devs or Preach or other people have really started hitting at that point from like a systems perspective. And I think we've gotten some good answers there. But I think like just saying like, hey, what are we thinking for classes this expansion? Because like, and honestly, I was not expecting any of these Shadow changes. And I'm very thankful that we've gotten them.
Yeah.
Because I think it was just
everyone's impressed.
Like a couple months ago, I could have swore they said something about like, well, we think most classes are done now, so they're probably going to go live like this. And I was sitting there just like, oh, please no. Oh,
it was
please,
like,
no.
I think they said like no more changes to resources, I think was what they said.
Yeah,
like,
they said
okay.
they said if there's a major overhaul, and that's probably still true, like a major overhaul, like a brand new resource design, etc., that's not happening. But something akin to like what Enhancement got, which is now you've gotten the enhancement treatment as well for Shadow, like that's still on the table and probably still is for another month or two.
I'm cautiously optimistic about what's happened here, but I'm also well aware of what happened to Ellie Shaman.
Unlucky.
Yeah.
Unlucky.
I want to make sure that people view what's happened here for what it is, and make it the best version of whatever it is it can be, instead of just sort of praising or lamenting the loss of voidform.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, like we're here now. Let's move forward with it and make it the best
Absolutely.
we can. And I think that's really great feedback in general. Just, I think Blizzard generally has been much better in all the alpha beta cycles I've done. I think they've been very good
100%.
about communication this round. But there is definitely a lack of more class-based feedback that we just don't have. A lot of talk about the systems and conduits and covenants, and it's great, and we love it. And there we know where their heads are at. But a lot of classes do feel like they're left in the dark. And having that sense of dev water cooler talk more frequently from the days of MOP, we know when Ghost Crawler did that kind of stuff, that's good. Because it just lets people know like what's going on. Like, hey, Shadow Priest, we hear you, just so you know. Like, we're working on it. but don't worry, like we hear you, we get in the feedback, we got you. Let's move on to one last topic here before we take some questions. Just because this is kind of impromptu, but people are asking about it in chat a lot. Any notables? We don't have to go through every single one because that would take a very long time. But any notable Covenant / Conduit combos / legendaries that you guys think are too far fetched, just way too overpowered, will be cookie cutter? Anything that you're surprised you didn't see or want to see, etc.
There's the big Mindbender interactions where you have a legendary, a Conduit, a Soulbind. I think there's a Soulbind and a Covenant ability that all affect the cooldown or damage or attack speed of Mindbender, and all of them together kind of, it's not just like locking you into a single option, it's locking your Covenant choice, it's locking your Conduits, it's locking everything. Like everything goes into buffing Mindbender as much as possible. And given Mindbender now gives a flat amount of insanity, which is converted directly into Devouring Plagues, makes the damage of Mindbender a lot more calculable and sort of obvious compared to just sort of ambiguously increasing voidform attacks, which is what it did previously.
And
it also,
at the same time,
damage.
It's also reducing cooldowns of 4 other people, right? Which I think is potentially maybe a bit too much for the game. Like, there's a lot of like crazy things that could happen because of that.
The cooldown reduction is weird because obviously you read cooldown reduction, you think, oh my god, this is amazing, and then you actually use cooldown reduction in a raid environment and realize it's kind of more like reducing
no one notices.
reducing a 3-minute cooldown by 10 seconds when it already has a specific point in the fight it's being used just doesn't impact anything. And this sort of very spread out weird cooldown reduction that isn't predictable and isn't big enough to have any real impact just ends up being like a net 0 damage increase or something across the raid. Because
and I think that kind of goes into like all of the abilities. I think all the Covenant abilities for Shadow specifically, like from a Shadow Priest perspective, are either pretty boring or just that unimpactful that I'm kind of like, and maybe this is what they wanted, I don't really know, because people asking, if I'm streaming or in Discords all day, like, what Covenant should I pick as Shadow? Like, what are you playing? What do you like the most? And the answer that we've been giving is, well, it just doesn't matter. They all kind of suck equally, or they're all unfun equally. They all just feel like they're kind of unfinished. Like they're like, there's an idea there that I think they could go with and really make something that's great. I don't think we're there yet.
They feel like the abilities of a Spec where 2/3 of its class heals.
Yeah,
that's what they feel. They feel like priest buttons.
Yeah,
they don't feel like Shadow buttons.
Right.
And Shadow is probably the least attached Spec to its core class out of the entire of the game, maybe, in terms of like how connected Shadow is to the idea of being a priest, how connected Feral is to the idea of being a druid, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Shadow is probably one of the most removed specs from its core class identity. So things that are focused purely on the class tend to impact Shadow quite negatively because they're not focused on what Shadow wants to do or cares about.
Yeah, and I think at this point we're probably going to pick a Covenant more for the Soulbinds that are behind them and those abilities,
we're going to pick
than the Covenant abilities.
And we're going to pick purely because of the N tier Soulbind right now.
Any notables for Soulbind Conduit combos that stick out to you guys for Shadow?
I mean, it's kind of just the whole Venthia get the Naja 20% haste thing is kind of what we're looking at the moment. There's a weird thing about, I'm sure you must have noticed this, Luke, but the percent stat conduits in the Soulbind trees are not actually percent stats. They act more like corruptions.
Correct.
So if I have 0 versatility and I have something that increases my versatility, it just doesn't do anything.
Yeah, it gets
right?
none.
So you have to have versatility to get a benefit from that type of thing. And most of them all do that, except for some of the Venthia
there are
ones.
two.
Right?
It's going to get bonkers later in the expansion, but
one.
Right.
Well, two of them don't. Social Butterfly from Dreamweaver doesn't, and Naja's Thrill Seeker doesn't either. I think General Draven's thing didn't, but it's also been removed? Question mark.
I think it got moved to a different Soulbind. It got moved to Theatar.
Oh, is it moved to Theatar? Okay, right, yeah. Okay, that's still strong,
and that one's really, really good because it's the end of Theatar's tree. You get some percent of versatility for yourself, and then a reduced amount for some allies.
But unlike things like the Necrolord Haste Soulbind, it's a flat percent stat, so it's literally just you go from 0% to 10%, instead of you gain like 5% of what you already had. Like the Corruption Soulbinds are just significantly weaker than all the stat Soulbinds, regardless. And since Shadow hasn't got a Slappy Hands or a Bone Spike or any other like really powerful ability that makes one spec, but that's particularly good for one spec. They're all just sort of meh. Like I think when we like ran the numbers, for example, didn't like Mind Games and Boon of the Ascended just were barely a DPS increase, if at all?
This is like they're all like I've put everything in SimC now, and again this was with the old voidform system. They were all like hardly noticeable. We got more impact from a legendary than we did most of our Covenant abilities. And I think that's also true. That's also true from like a gameplay perspective. Like, really don't change what we're doing very much. They're kind of just there. But you know, some of these soulbinds are like, wow, you know, that would be awesome for Mythic Plus, or this one's clearly what I want to have in Mythic Plus. But you know, the rating soulbind just doesn't make sense.
Somewhere else, etc. It's Shadow is a position where if Blizzard leave all the conduits and soulbinds as they are, Shadow's in a relatively good position where it never feels like it needs something from the borrowed power system.
Right. Yeah.
Like it.
But I don't know if that was the goal of the system.
I don't know if that was the goal.
Well,
of the
we
system,
don't really care. So
where it is right now, it legitimately feels like it's not even. It doesn't even feel like a meaningful choice for us. It feels like we're just literally rolling a d4 and then picking one, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, I remember going
if you don't care about lore or story, it's weird. I know obviously lore and story and like what the non-combat benefits of these soulbinds or conduits and not covenants is supposed to be important, but it feels strange that we don't have anything that's even fun to use.
Yeah, I remember I did like my videos for all that Covenant stuff, and every time I got to like Rogue or Priest for the Covenant abilities, I was like, oh boy.
I do appreciate your deadpan puns.
I gotta say though, from maybe a like raid leading or group leading or whatever perspective, I did place some value and interest in the Necrolord one. I'm not sure if they've changed it because it was uncapped for everything you hit, and the faster you hit, the more you self-heal. So that seems kind of crazy for some situations.
It's just a bit weird that a 15 conduitable to 20-second dot is for mass AoE, because how often does 20 mobs spawn that you want to Nova and they live 20 seconds after that point?
Yeah, but I was also thinking from the support perspective, right? The amount of self-healing.
That's a lot of healing.
It's like a JOL on crack, right? It's like
same with Kieran.
JOL.
The Kieran ability also does a massive amount of healing.
Yeah,
It playing into the healing part of the spec, right?
Yeah, it comes back to that. They feel like priest buttons, not shadow buttons.
They're just like weird to play with though, because they're such a short range, and it's from a ranged class perspective, it feels a little disjointed because you know Necrolord's a 15-yard range. The Kyrian ability, the one that you spam, is only an 8-yard range.
Kyrian Nova is absolutely tiny. It's horrendous,
and it's just like kind of weird to play with when we're a ranged class. But yeah, so.
Okay. One last question, and then we'll take some questions from the chat. If player power wasn't a thing, what Covenant would you take from a lore perspective, from a coolness perspective?
Lore perspective purely?
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd go Night Fae, personally.
Ooh, that's like I think a lot of people on our staff would pick Night Fae. Actually, I'm a vampire all the way. I'm definitely Venthyr 100%.
You are way too edgy.
Yeah, it's gotta be Venthyr. It's clearly the best choice. So
I really like the Night Fae aesthetic. I don't particularly like the voice acting.
Oh yeah,
I'm gonna put that out there.
No, Preach loves it. I heard a lot of people.
I played the game without sound. That was purely that I played the game with sound a lot because I used to PvP a lot without add-ons. So I had the sound on for like a lot of things. And then I started playing with Sphere of Insanity in Legion, and I just turned the sound off, and I've never gone back. So I don't have the IAR kind of vibe that a lot of people get from Ardenweald. However, if you put a gun to my head and told me to put the sound on the entirety of my time playing WoW, I would have to go Necrolord gets a dog you can pet in the fucking you get like there is if you walk into Necrolord Sanctum and turn left, there is a dog you can pet. Yeah, how can you beat that?
Close second.
With a stick?
Oh no.
No.
Oh no.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Let's grab a couple questions here that some people have been waiting to ask. Ms. Renna says, My question to you two, of course, will they make any more changes such as Covenant's legendaries now that priests have changed so much, i.e. Night Fae Covenant ability has it based off of Voidbolt, but now we don't have access to it as often. Seems awkward.
Yeah, agreed. I think that Blizzard needs to take a look now at what buttons our spec is actually pressing and think about how they want to buff those buttons instead of the buttons we were pressing before.
There's also, like, the Kyrian ability replaces Mind Flay.
That was
before, like, we don't really care. It's a filler spell. We were mad it didn't give Insanity. It does now. But I think now that Mind Flay is a much more impactful part of a rotation than it used to be, or just, like, Mind Seer in general. And the Kyrian ability is just kind of like, you're going into, like, a separate form using it. And I think that also needs to get revisited.
You sort of just stop playing Shadow and start playing Kyrian.
Right.
And while you have so many interactions that are based on Shadow, you just lose all of those interactions with Kyrian. And because Kyrian's balanced around the other two specs that have those interactions in the first place, it's just sort of inherently weak because of that. So we're not much of a fan of it.
Just because you mentioned Mind Flay as well, I forgot to mention, because it just came out.
The 4 second
Exactly, yeah. Mind Flay is now a 4-second channel instead of 3.
I don't like this.
Okay.
Just to put it very clearly, Shadow's abilities, and the reason it feels so smooth to play, is that all of your abilities either have one GCD cast time, or have a cooldown or channel time that is some multiple of the GCD. The base GCD is 1.5 seconds, obviously, which kind of goes back to why Mind Blast was such a problem up until this point, and why we were so happy earlier that it got changed from a 8-second cast to a 7.5-second cast. And it's this whole 7.5 divided by 1.5 is 5, etc. kind of thing that fits together. 4 divided by 1.5 is not a round number. So we end up in this position where the global is ticking round, but the spell's finished.
Right, yeah, that's awful.
You just can't do anything in that position. It just doesn't feel very nice. Shadow has this smoothness to it, which I'm sure is probably a big draw in for you, especially because you said, like, you enjoyed the multi-dotting thing of of Legion, where it feels like every time your GCD ticks round again, there's another button available for you to press.
Right. And this feels like just an oversight. I think their head was in the right place with why they increased this, because now we can cast Mind Blast during Mind Flay. I think it's just like a slight oversight of like how it interacts with the GCD. So
simple answer, make it 4.5 seconds, and we're incredibly happy with it at that point.
All right.
Just make it 4.5 seconds.
Okay. Next question. With this current iteration of Shadow, aka the changes we've just seen, would you personally still rather have Orbs or Insanity?
I find Insanity a little bit thematically challenged, because now we've gone from entering void form with Insanity to casting a plague with Insanity, which is a bit weird. I have to admit as well that Shadow Orbs sounds like a developer's rough draft of an example that accidentally got pushed into a build, in terms of it has no thematic logic at all, and it looks like somebody had drawn a resource system in Notepad to just show someone how it worked. It never really felt very thematic or logical. I still prefer Shadow Orbs because I prefer Shadow Orbs because of what it had in terms of how different spells did their damage, and the fact that Orbs was focused purely on Mind Blast, and so your non-Mind Blast spells were kind of there to be pressed for damage, and you didn't feel that bad about moving too much and not being able to press them. As long as you were pressing Blast on cooldown, you were always getting as many resources as you could, and that felt good. So tying resources to every aspect of the spec, counter to what Ellie Shamans are saying, in the case of Shadow Priest, is definitely can be considered a downside.
Okay. Public?
I think thematically, I don't really see a big change either way. I think Insanity was all about like, I'm like literally going insane with the spec, and I think with the removal of like haste from the spec almost entirely, it doesn't really exist anymore. So it's more just like another resource that we have. I don't know. I think it's fine. I think going back to Shadow Orbs might just be I don't know if it's a cop out or whatever, but I think there are things they can do to like tune Insanity differently to make it more valuable. Like, for example, they removed the Insanity on Shadow or Death, right? They clearly gave that an avenue that wasn't just Insanity generation. And I think now that we don't just have void form controlling the entire spec, I think they have some room to maneuver, and I think we're in a better spot because of it.
There was this sort of assumption or like kind of schism in the spec, I guess, where while we were draining insanity passively, anytime you weren't generating it, just inherently felt bad. I don't think that's as much the case now, but the more of the spec that generates insanity, the worse the small things that don't feel. Like, what worked with orbs was only one button was tied to your resource generation, so everything else felt fine not being. Whereas right now it feels like dots are tied to it, spirits are tied to it, flay is tied to it, seer is tied to it, crash is tied to it, torrent is tied to it. All this stuff is tied to how much resource you generate, so those small things here and there that don't feel a little bit out of place.
Okay. Quick thoughts on how the Mindflay legendary is currently.
I just don't like it because it's. I love Tentabro. I love his back, my adorable little squiggly pet, and I love him. But I never really thought of him in this way. Sorry, Tentabro, but I never really thought of him as a legendary. I thought of him as like a little flavor tool that kind of pops up here and there and inadvertently helps with mobility, because he's like say 8% of your Mindflay damage is now this Tentabro, and it continues while you're running, as opposed to stopping when you stop, as opposed to like stopping like a Mindflay does. So I kind of saw him like that. I wasn't expecting a completely passive fire and forget legendary that had zero impact on how you chose to play your spec. I was not particularly expecting that when Blizzard like said legendaries. I think Mindflay Insanity is probably a better thing to put in this spot, as far as a legendary that increases Mindflay damage inadvertently, or at the very least, I would like Mindseer to proc the talent.
Yeah, the fact that it's just Mindflay, considering we have Seer as well, and like we literally don't have an AoE legendary option right now. Not really.
Shadow has 3 legendary choices right now, and all 3 are pure single target. Well,
So
actually, 2 of them are single target. One of them is AoE healing, which is a bit weird.
Yeah, I think it just needs. I think thematically it's awesome. Like I love having tentacles back. It was really upsetting the fact that other people got them with Twisted Appendage in BFA.
Yeah, I didn't like that at all.
That was just a slap across the face. But so at least they're back in some capacity now. I just don't know. It seems a little too. I don't know. They're probably going to be too good. Also, like the fact they generate all this insanity and do damage.
They felt from what we've played with
control,
them, but they feel very high variance. They don't feel very consistent. It's like sometimes you might get a pull where you have 4 tentacles up at once and you're just sort of melting anything that's in front of you. Other times you're sitting there waiting a minute for a single proc.
Sounds like corruption.
Feel sad.
Sounds like yeah.
Yeah, it genuinely feels like playing with Twisted Appendage, which is not nice.
Yeah, which I didn't like it before because I wanted more consistent insanity to get out 2 Devouring Plagues inside of a void form. But now that we have this reworked system, that might not matter as much. I'm not really sure. It might just be kind of there. It's not super impactful, but they're there. They're thematic. So I don't know if we, I think my biggest problem with it in general is that from a legendary perspective, I'm either choosing to do more damage or to get utility and, have something that changes my gameplay.
Right.
And the choices don't feel fleshed out yet. But
okay.
Yeah, it's a bit weird.
On that, in that vein, next question is, what utility spells or talents, I assume, do you wish for if you could replace dead talents like Mind Bomb?
Allow me to Google very quickly because I've forgotten the name of the fucking mob.
But yeah, we kind of
Void
touched on this
Orb.
one earlier.
Yeah, it's called Void Orb. It is that it? No, that's the one from the other. Where is it?
Well, you look for it. I think, just in general, I would say either make Mind Bomb a stun again, give Shackle Undead a better CC experience. That would also help with everything. If it worked on more mob types. And maybe instead of having Void Tendril as a talent, or Void Tendril as a legendary, it's instead a talent that grips your target to some location or whatever, like the black hole he was suggesting or whatever else. That's what I'd rather see personally.
I believe I found it.
Just
it is it is an ability called Void Orb. It is taught by an NPC. Not taught by, but it's used by an NPC called Darkspear Jolar, or Darkspeaker Jolar, and he lives on the border of Nazmir, and he has this button, which I'm going to link you, and just if you want to look at it.
Sure. Where are you linking it? Oh, there it is.
It's a button that exists in the game already, and I was reasonably peeved when I saw it being used against me in beta, after we'd asked for an ability that roughly
Because
worked
you
like
want
this.
it.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I remember you describing it earlier. I'll link it in chat for people as well. All right, let's
It
breathe.
doesn't need, I don't think it needs to do damage. I think that's just because it's a boss ability, so you have to care about it. But the dragging aspect is something that was really interesting to me, especially because it was coded properly.
What a big sword he has. Let's breeze through a couple more of these, and then I mean we're not gonna be able to get through all of these. Everybody wants obviously their own individual.
Tegu's already pointed out this has been going on for quite a long time.
Yeah, we gotta wrap it up here. So we'll take like 2-3 more questions, and we just skim through. Sorry if we don't get to some of them, chat. We definitely won't, but that's why these guys have their lovely social below their cams here, so you can poke and contact them. One that I've been seeing a lot is, what do you guys think they should do about DP since it's not stackable? You mentioned the kind of single target problem before and clipping. What do you think a good change for that would be? A fix for that would be?
The fact that Blizzard already reduced it from 12 to 6 and mentioned in their post that they're worried about the clipping issue kind of tells me that it's something that they're already concerned with and they would be receptive for feedback about. I think being able to ending up having casting Devouring Plague more often than 6 seconds on one target is definitely possible, and it's definitely going to get even more and more likely as we get more gear. There's 3 options I can see to fix this. 1, treat Devouring Plague like Legion UA. Not particularly a fan of this, but it does work. 2,
Where you can have multiple on one target is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
2, shuffle a load of the damage from Devouring Plague into the initial hit, so that even if you are overlapping the dot, the initial hit's still coming through and you're getting value that way. Or the 3rd option is to find some way to reduce the uptime through the rotation and keep the rotation as fulfilling and interesting as it would be if you were Devouring Plaguing every 4 seconds, which is something I consider quite a challenge, but definitely an option to pursue.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is like maybe instead they could have it, if you cast it like again it like spreads differently. It is a plague after all, but it has no kind of like spreading mechanic like Unholy does.
The fact that the plague doesn't spread is a bit weird. Yeah, you're
so
right.
they could do something with that instead, where if you cast it again, it then spreads instead, or kind of like we have a talent where if you cast it again, it does something differently. So maybe something like that. I think or they could also just take a different way and give us some AoE spender of Insanity baseline. To also give us
like
another
bigger
option.
options.
Yeah, give you another option if you
well,
don't want to cast Devouring Plague, right?
The AoE spender they've given us is the Searing Nightmare button, but it's also a talent. So while I get what they're trying to go for, I think that makes sense. Oh, Mario just said, or let the duration stack, or let the duration stack just increase, like just the dot gets longer and longer and longer. The worry with that is, like, if at the end of the fight, all you've ended up doing with that is accumulating a 36-second dot that's just not going to do damage to the boss, it's essentially the same thing. You've just made it look nicer on the.
Yeah.
Like you're still wasting. You're still
you're
wasting that
waiting
damage
for the
anyway
dot.
because it just never happens.
So somebody suggested Mind Spike as well as a potential other spender.
Maybe.
Not in the use that everyone remembers it having. I'm not a particularly big fan of the whole removing your own dots kind of gameplay. But Mind Spike is a button that has done many, many things in the past, including something in Legion including versions in Legion that people barely remember having and were terrible. But the button's always there as an option to like do something new or interesting, and having it do something new or interesting would be great.
Alrighty. Final question here. Would you like to see anything from the Priest kit, from Disc or Holy specifically, that you think should be an addition to Shadow?
I think Prayer of Mending should be baseline for priests, and I would quite like Fear Ward back for everybody.
I would, Fear would be cool. I would also, I kind of miss the days of like Halo and Cascade being a thing. Divine Star, not so much.
The Halo Cascade Divine Star tree is just always going to be one of my favorite things of
Yeah, it was fun. And like, I remember it in WoD, it was super broken, and Ashran just cascading everywhere, and it was a lot of fun. That would be because those both Disc and Holy still have those, right? Pretty sure.
I have some pretty obnoxious memories of Cascade, especially after they changed it in BRF tier to the point where they changed it from only ever being able to hit the same target once to being able to hit the same target twice, which meant you did not actually need 30 targets to get it to hit everything.
Right,
You could
yeah.
make it hit everything with 12 targets. They're ridiculous. And
It was fun. It was fun to press.
caused a lot of damage, and like Battlegrounds were incredibly ridiculous with talent.
Right.
Alrighty, gents. So I noticed like some of the questions just are things, by the way, that we've gone over. I don't know if this has been definitely gone a bit over time, let's say, but that's all good. It was needed. Shadow Priest needed to get it out of their system, so that's okay. But definitely some people, I'm sure, joined halfway through, guys. So some of the questions you're asking were covered. You can always check the VOD. I'll put it up on YouTube, etc. And most of the stuff was answered or kind of gone over already. So
there was a point about. There was a point very early on actually about Mythic Plus and Shadow being incredibly effective right now in Mythic Plus, and I kind of want to address this because I kind of want to address this before I let it fester. But yeah, Shadow was really, really strong right now in Mythic Plus in terms of raw damage output, as long as like the group is playing around you and you have these ridiculous amounts of stats right now from corruption, which is kind of offsetting
Right.
what voidform was trying to do in the first place. Like Shadow was strong because of voidform, and voidform was trying to give us loads of crit. But once we had like 80% baseline crit, voidform was no longer that necessary. And that seems like something that's incredibly specific to the current situation we're playing in, and is also still propped up quite a lot by Azerite Beam and Essences, which are not as impactful for other specs, I'm gonna say, in terms of Mythic Plus performance. Like I've seen people even end up still playing like. I mean, Beam's still really, really strong, people, but like most people's Beams don't have 100% crit chance.
Right.
Okay. All right, guys. So it's been a pleasure, gents. I'm sure this could go on for many days. It seems you guys are. I gotta say, it's really. No, it's not a bad thing. It's really humbling to see how like passionate guys like you are about your class and spec. That doesn't just come out as like, you know, screw Blizzard, like you guys are idiots. Like it was warming to have a discussion like this to see what you guys are thinking, and I think it was a good representation, hopefully, of the community. Obviously, I don't know the Shadow Priest community that well, but it was nice to see. So I appreciate it a lot, guys. Thank you for everything. We'll put this up on YouTube for sure, and definitely looking forward to hearing your guys' thoughts as you finally get to sit down and play the spec.
Yeah,
and
yeah, we've been sitting here watching it.
Yeah, running all kinds of specs in this sea of Shadow Priest playing here, and I'm gonna grab my own thoughts on it too. So, do you have any parting thoughts before we head off here?
I think I just want to say, like, thank you to Blizzard for listening, for, you know, giving us changes. This is very heartwarming to see, and honestly, you know, thanks Salute for inviting us on here to talk about it. I mean, this is more than anything I was expecting, and I think, you know, really, you know, put some value in all the feedback we gave. So I'm very appreciative of that. So
I think it would not be an exaggeration to call this unprecedented, given that this is near enough like Voidform was the spec until this point. So it would not be a stretch to call this a rework. I know obviously you called it enhancement like changes in terms of it's still the same resource, it's still the same core interactions, but things have changed a bit. Going from 90% Voidform uptime to like 12% Voidform uptime is a big change. And we were not expecting anything close to this going into what we anticipated there was something coming. And obviously the quote-unquote vague tweet that appeared a few days ago definitely alluded to a bit more than maybe some tiny changes, but we are expecting something big. This is massive. It's a bit rough around the edges, and people are going to have their initial impressions, and we need to make sure this gets iterated and worked through as quickly and consistently and respectfully as possible, because we have to still remember some people have definitely lost the spec they fell in love with in this game, in this patch.
All right.
And I think we can't forget that as well.
Very true. All right, guys, it's been a pleasure. Make note of their socials up above. You need to get a Twitter account, Ellipsis, by the way.
I hate social media.
It's easier to get some thoughts out, though. All right, guys, thanks a lot for spending the time. I really appreciate it a lot. I think Publik's cam is frozen, or he's very, very, very fixated on something right now. But
he's like a cat.
but I think his cam is frozen right now, so I will... his internet.
His internet's dead.
Well, good timing, I suppose. Internet just died now. So it's been a pleasure, Ellipsis and Publik, if you can still hear, hopefully with being on mobile or something, guys. We'll catch up later. I'm definitely curious to hear your thoughts as things develop with the spec. So thanks a lot for hanging out today.
I'm curious to sort of get a hold of this and kind of read the room on terms of how everyone feels about it.
For sure.
Because it looks interesting. There are worries it could be a bit boring, but that's every caster with 10% haste. So
That's everyone that wants haste at the beginning of an expansion.
I mean, outlaw rogues kind of get to chill, but yeah.
Alrighty, my dude. Well,
Wonderful.
my dude's but my dude currently. Thanks a lot for hanging out, guys. Have fun. Hope you enjoyed. Oh, there he's back.
Oh, he's back.
Publik was just saying our goodbyes. So thanks a lot for hanging out, dudes. It's been a pleasure and curious to hear from you guys in the future with the changes, and hopefully it continues to go in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you
thanks
for
again,
inviting
Sleep.
us on.
All right, bye bye, guys.
Wonderful.